Hello everyone and welcome to Mr. Hex. If you're looking for creepy stories to help you relax and fall asleep, or you simply enjoy listening to scary stories during the quiet hours of the night, you're in the right place. Before we begin, if you enjoy the story, please take a moment to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support truly means a lot to me and helps the channel continue to grow. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy tonight's story. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. I've always been one to prefer the company of trees over humans. There's something about the silence of the woods that suits me better than any conversation ever could. My name's Wade Kessler, and back in 2001, I found myself working as a forest ranger near the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. Never thought I'd be the type to spend my days alone in the woods, but after a couple of rough years in the city, it turned out that isolation wasn't just an option. It was a necessity. I grew up in Kansas in a small town nobody's ever heard of. Let's just say if you wanted to leave, you either needed a car or a pair of really tough shoes. Didn't have much growing up, but I had enough to get by, and that was fine by me. Nothing special about my upbringing except maybe for that one year when my dad tried to raise goats in our backyard. Trust me, there's a reason I don't miss the smell of home. After high school, I drifted for a while, working odd jobs and trying to figure out what I wanted from life. Ended up in Chicago, thinking the big city might have some answers. Scored a job in corporate security, but it didn't take long to realize I was suffocating in that concrete jungle. The constant noise, the endless sea of faces, none of it felt right. I'd come home to my shoebox apartment every night, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. It was during one of those sleepless nights staring at the ceiling and listening to the city's never-ending hum that I stumbled across an ad for forest ranger positions. The promise of open spaces and solitude called to something deep inside me. Within a week, I'd packed up my meager belongings and headed south. Arriving at the ranger station near Ouachita, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. The air was clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The quiet wasn't oppressive like in the city. It was alive, punctuated by bird calls and the rustle of leaves in the wind. My first few months on the job were uneventful. I learned the trails, familiarized myself with the local wildlife, and settled into a routine that suited me just fine. You'd be surprised how well you sleep when your closest neighbor is a few miles of untouched wilderness. The job itself wasn't too bad, a little monotonous at times, but the minimal paperwork and fresh air more than made up for it. Of course, dealing with people was still part of the gig. You'd be amazed at the stupid stuff folks get up to in national forests. Once had to pull a guy out of a tree after he tried to take a selfie with a black bear. Then there was the time I had to stop a group of teenagers from setting up a bonfire in the middle of a dry patch during fire season. I swear people either don't know or don't care what they're getting into out here. But for the most part, my days were my own. I'd patrol the trails, check on campsites, and lose myself in the rhythm of the forest. There was a peace to it that I'd never known before. Even on the toughest days, when the weather turned foul or I had to deal with particularly troublesome visitors, I never regretted my decision to come here. As summer faded into fall that year, I felt more at home in those woods than I ever had anywhere else. The trees were starting to turn, painting the forest in shades of gold and red. The air had a crisp edge to it, carrying the promise of colder days to come. It was my favorite time of year, when the summer crowds had thinned out and the forest seemed to belong to itself again. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found my place in the world, how I could spend the rest of my days out here, content in the solitude and the simple routines of ranger life. I had no idea then how quickly things could change, how thin the line was between peaceful isolation and terrifying loneliness. It was early September when things started getting weird, the kind of weird that makes you question if the job's really worth the isolation. The park had been quiet for most of the week. A few hikers here and there, the occasional campers who thought they were deep in the wild when really, they were just a couple of miles off the main road. But on the third day of my shift, I got a call on the radio that would change everything. A missing person report. Some woman saying her husband never came back from an early morning hike. As I grabbed my gear and headed out to meet her, I had no idea I was about to step into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. Little did I know, the forest I thought I knew so well was about to reveal a darker side, one that would test not just my skills as a ranger, but my very grip on reality. When I got to the campsite, the wife, Karen something or other, was pacing around frantic. She was older, maybe in her early 50s, with a sunburn that told me they hadn't been using nearly enough sunscreen. She was babbling about how her husband, Paul, had gone off toward a trail that wasn't even on the map. Said he had a thing for exploring uncharted paths. I felt the first tug of worry right then. There's no shortage of ways to get hurt out there, and if Paul had wandered off the main trail, finding him might take a bit longer than I originally thought. I radioed for backup, but since it was midweek, the park was running skeleton staff. I'd have to start the search on my own. I tried to calm Karen down, get some more details about Paul's plans. She said he'd left around dawn, carrying just a small day pack with some water and snacks. He'd promised to be back by noon for lunch. It was now approaching 4 p.m., and there'd been no sign of him. He's an experienced hiker, Karen said, her voice cracking. He wouldn't just get lost. Something must have happened to him. I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. In my experience, even experienced hikers can make mistakes. But I didn't say that to Karen. Instead, I assured her we'd find Paul and asked her to stay at the campsite in case he returned. As I set off into the woods, following the direction Karen had pointed out, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest seemed different somehow, the familiar trails suddenly alien and unwelcoming. I chalked it up to the urgency of the situation and pressed on. About a mile in, I found Paul's footprints in the soft dirt. They were easy enough to follow at first, heading straight toward a dense thicket. But then something strange happened. His tracks stopped, not gradually like he'd slowed down or turned around. They just ended. I crouched down looking for any signs of where he might have gone. Maybe he'd hopped onto a rock or changed direction. I walked a few paces back and forth, but there was nothing. No disturbed leaves, no broken branches. It was like the guy had just vanished. The uneasy feeling settled into my gut like a rock. I've seen people get lost, take a wrong turn, or even walk off cliffs, but they don't just stop leaving tracks. I called in my findings, and they told me to wait for others to arrive. But something about the silence in those woods was pressing on me, making the air feel thick. I decided to keep going. I moved past the point where Paul's tracks disappeared, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have for the time of day. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. After about another half hour, I came across something I didn't expect to see out there. Blood. It wasn't a lot, just a few drops scattered across the mossy ground leading deeper into the trees. Now, I know what you're thinking. Animals, right? Plenty of things out in the wild can bleed. But the smell hit me before I could even make sense of it. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. Metallic, sure, but also wrong. Like rotting meat mixed with something sharp, almost chemical. I should have turned back. I should have waited for backup. But there's this part of you that takes over when you're in a situation like that. It's the same instinct that makes people slow down to look at a car wreck. You don't want to, but you can't help it. So I followed the blood trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. Not just because of the trees closing in either. There was something off about the light. It was dim, even though I knew it was only early afternoon. I felt like I'd stepped into another world, one where the sun couldn't quite reach. As I pushed through a thick stand of bushes, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing ahead, there was a figure. At first I thought it was Paul, maybe injured and huddled on the ground. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't Paul at all. It wasn't human. At first I thought it was some sort of large animal hunched over something in the distance, maybe a bear, or possibly a cougar. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. Its body was lanky, almost skeletal, covered in patches of matted fur. The limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin, and the way it moved made my stomach churn. It was bending over something that wasn't moving. I knew what it was before I even got close. Paul. Or at least what was left of him. The thing noticed me before I could even think about turning back. It straightened up, and for a second we just stared at each other. If I had to compare it to anything, I'd say it looked like a deer that had decided it wanted to walk on two legs and got it horribly, horribly wrong. Its face was elongated, the jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. But it wasn't its face that scared me the most. It was the silence. Even when it moved, there wasn't a sound. No crunching leaves, no snapping twigs, nothing. And then it charged. I moved past the point where Paul's tracks disappeared, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have for the time of day. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. After about another half hour, I came across something I didn't expect to see out there. Blood. It wasn't a lot, just a few drops scattered across the mossy ground leading deeper into the trees. Now I know what you're thinking. Animals, right? Plenty of things out in the wild can bleed. But the smell hit me before I could even make sense of it. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. Metallic, sure, but also wrong. Like rotting meat mixed with something sharp, almost chemical. I should have turned back. I should have waited for backup. But there's this part of you that takes over when you're in a situation like that. It's the same instinct that makes people slow down to look at a car wreck. You don't want to, but you can't help it. So I followed the blood trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. Not just because of the trees closing in either. There was something off about the light. It was dim, even though I knew it was only early afternoon. I felt like I'd stepped into another world, one where the sun couldn't quite reach. As I pushed through a thick stand of bushes, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing ahead, there was a figure. At first I thought it was Paul, maybe injured and huddled on the ground. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't Paul at all. It wasn't human. At first I thought it was some sort of large animal hunched over something in the distance. Maybe a bear, or possibly a cougar. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. Its body was lanky, almost skeletal, covered in patches of matted fur. The limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin. And the way it moved made my stomach churn. It was bending over something that wasn't moving. I knew what it was before I even got close. Paul, or at least what was left of him. The thing noticed me before I could even think about turning back. It straightened up, and for a second we just stared at each other. If I had to compare it to anything, I'd say it looked like a deer that had decided it wanted to walk on two legs and got it horribly, horribly wrong. Its face was elongated, the jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. But it wasn't its face that scared me the most. It was the silence. Even when it moved, there wasn't a sound. No crunching leaves, no snapping twigs, nothing. And then it charged. I don't remember running. I don't remember much of anything except the sound of my heartbeat in my ears and the sharp sting of branches whipping against my face as I tore through the forest. Whatever that thing was, it was fast. Faster than anything that size should have been. I could feel it gaining on me, that suffocating silence growing louder, pressing in from all sides. I didn't dare look back, but I knew it was there, just a few steps behind me. Then, out of nowhere, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a steep slope, crashing through bushes and landing hard on my side. For a moment, everything went black, When I came to, the creature was gone, but I wasn't about to wait around to see if it came back for round two. I limped back toward the main trail, praying I was heading in the right direction. I'd lost my radio in the fall, so there was no way to call for help. My only hope was getting back to the station before the thing found me again. By the time I stumbled into the ranger station, it was already dusk. Karen was gone, taken back to the nearest town by one of the other rangers. I collapsed into a chair, my whole body shaking. The other rangers on duty rushed to my side, asking what had happened. But how could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I told them about finding Paul's body, about being chased by something. But I left out the details of the creature. I couldn't bring myself to describe it, couldn't face the disbelief I knew I'd see in their eyes. Instead, I said it was too dark to see clearly, that whatever attacked Paul had come after me too. They called in a search team, but by the time they reached the area I'd described, there was nothing left to find. No blood, no body, and no sign of the creature. It didn't make any sense. I know what I saw, and I know Paul was dead, but there was no proof, no evidence. Just an empty forest, and the sick feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The official report chalked it up to a possible animal attack, with Paul's body likely dragged off by predators. They commended me for my efforts in the search, but advised me to take some time off to recover from the traumatic experience. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, couldn't forget the inhuman way it moved. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its twisted form charging towards me. Sleep became impossible, plagued by nightmares of being chased through endless dark woods. The worst part was the doubt. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had the stress and isolation finally gotten to me? I found myself questioning everything, jumping at shadows and flinching at every unexpected sound. I tried to go back to work, to lose myself in the familiar routines of ranger life. But the forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a threat. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, waiting. A couple of weeks later, another hiker went missing. Same area, same circumstances. His wife said he'd wandered off to explore some uncharted trail. They found his body the next day, or at least what was left of it. Nobody talked about it, though. The official report said it was a bear attack. I knew better. I knew what was out there. But who would believe me? The days following the second disappearance were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. The other rangers noticed my distraction, my jumpiness. They chalked it up to stress from the recent incidents, suggested I take some more time off. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I needed answers. I started digging into the park's records, looking for any similar incidents in the past. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The usual accidents, people getting lost and found, the occasional animal attack. But then I noticed a pattern. Every few years there would be a cluster of disappearances, always in the same general area of the forest. The official reports varied. Animal attacks, falls, hikers simply never found. But the timing and location were too consistent to be coincidence. I tried to bring my findings to my supervisor, but he brushed me off. "You're seeing patterns where there aren't any, Wade," he said. "Take some time off, clear your head." But I couldn't let it go. I started spending my off hours in the library of the nearest town, poring over old newspapers and local history books. I found mentions of similar incidents going back decades, always dismissed or explained away. There were even older stories, passed down by the indigenous people of the area, about a part of the forest that was best avoided. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that there was something out there, something that had been preying on people for generations. But the truth seemed so impossible, so outside the realm of what I thought I knew about the world, that I struggled to accept it myself. I started taking extra shifts, volunteering to patrol the area where the disappearances had occurred. My colleagues thought I was being dedicated, trying to prevent any more incidents. In reality, I was looking for proof, something I could use to convince others of what I'd seen. Weeks passed with no sign of the creature. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the stress and isolation had finally broken something in my mind. But then, on a cold October night, I saw it again. I was doing a late patrol, checking on some campsites near the area of the disappearances. The forest was quiet, most of the autumn leaves already fallen, leaving the trees bare and skeletal in the moonlight. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but then I saw those impossibly long limbs, that unnatural gait. It was far off, moving through the trees parallel to the trail. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would hear me. For a moment it paused, its head swiveling in my direction. I could have sworn those empty eyes locked onto mine, even across that distance. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I radioed in, reporting a possible large predator sighting. But by the time a team arrived to check it out, there was nothing to find. No tracks, no sign of disturbance, just like before. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. Couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when I knew what was lurking in those woods. But I also couldn't leave without trying to warn people, to prevent more disappearances. The next day I went to my supervisor and handed in my resignation. He seemed surprised, but not entirely shocked. "You've been through a lot lately," he said. "Maybe some time away will do you good." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that I wasn't running away from the memories of what had happened, but from the certainty that it would happen again? As I packed up my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was abandoning my post, leaving others vulnerable to whatever was out there. But what could I do? No one believed me, and I had no proof. All I had were my nightmares and the gnawing certainty that the forest held secrets darker than anyone realized. I left a detailed report of my findings, my suspicions about the pattern of disappearances. I knew it would probably be dismissed, filed away and forgotten, but I had to try. Maybe someday, someone would connect the dots. Maybe they'd be more prepared than I was when they encountered what lurked in the shadows of those woods. As I drove away from the ranger station for the last time, I caught a glimpse of the forest in my rearview mirror. For a second, I could have sworn I saw a tall, skeletal figure standing at the tree line, watching me go. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that something was out there, something that defied explanation. And I knew that no matter how far I ran, the memory of what I'd seen in those woods would haunt me for the rest of my life. Mkamilgadwet hearts. The fog rolled in thick over the Appalachian Mountains, cloaking the forest in a ghostly veil that early autumn morning. My name is Nolan Thorne, and I've been a park ranger here in West Virginia for the past 7 years. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army, I traded the arid landscapes and constant tension for the vast, serene expanse of the Monongahela National Forest. The woods have a way of calming my hypervigilant mind, softening the edges of memories I'd rather forget. I like to think I've found my place among the ancient trees and hidden hollows. That crisp September day, I was scheduled to check on some remote trails near the Blackwater Falls area. It's a less traveled section of the park, which makes it my favorite. Untouched and wild, it reminds me why I fell in love with this job in the first place. I packed my gear methodically. First aid kit, radio, GPS, enough food and water for a day's hike, and my trusty Benchmade knife. A thermos of strong black coffee completed my preparations. As I locked up my small cabin on the outskirts of the ranger station, the sun was just beginning to peek over the ridgeline, casting long shadows through the mist. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. I breathed deeply, letting the forest air fill my lungs before setting out on the trail. The first few miles were familiar territory. I nodded a greeting to Mrs. Larson, an elderly birdwatcher who frequented the area, her binoculars already trained on a nearby stand of oaks. "Morning, Nolan," she called out cheerfully. "Keep an eye out for that barred owl nest I told you about. Should be about 3 miles in, just off the rhododendron trail." I promised I would, making a mental note. Mrs. Larson's keen eyes had helped us track several protected species over the years. As I continued deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by nature's symphony. Birds chirping their morning songs, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, and the distant staccato tapping of a woodpecker hard at work. The trail grew steep, winding its way up the mountainside. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the cool air. I paused to take a swig of water, surveying the vista that opened up before me. Miles of unbroken forest stretched to the horizon, a patchwork of green and gold as the earliest trees began their autumn transformation. It was moments like these that reaffirmed my decision to make this place my home. As midday approached, I reached a small clearing where wild asters and goldenrod painted the ground in bursts of purple and yellow. It seemed like a good place to take a break. I found a fallen log, brushed off some moss, and sat down to enjoy my lunch. The thermos of coffee was still warm, and I sipped it slowly, letting my mind wander. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, something that shattered the tranquility of the forest. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustle of leaves, but unmistakable. A scream. Human, filled with terror, echoing through the trees. I stood up quickly, nearly spilling my coffee, and strained to pinpoint the direction. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then it came again, more desperate this time, and abruptly cut off. My heart began to race, the familiar surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I grabbed my radio, clicking it on with shaking fingers. "Dispatch, this is Thorne. I'm about 8 miles east of Blackwater Falls near the old fire tower. I just heard what sounds like a distress call coming from the ridge to the north. Any hikers reported in that area?" The radio crackled, and dispatch responded. "Negative, Nolan. We don't have any permitted hikes in that section today. Proceed with caution. Do you need backup?" I hesitated, weighing the urgency of the situation against protocol. "Not yet. I'm going to investigate. I'll radio in if I find anything. Over." "Copy that. Be careful out there, Thorne." I quickly packed up my gear and headed in the direction of the scream. The forest seemed different now, the friendly green canopy suddenly oppressive and dark. Shadows stretched longer between the trees, and every snapping twig under my boots made me flinch. As I moved, I began to notice signs of disturbance. Broken branches, trampled underbrush, a scrap of bright blue fabric snagged on a thorny bush. Then I found it. A backpack lying open on the forest floor, its contents spilled out haphazardly. Nearby, the ground was stained dark. I knelt down, touching the damp soil with trembling fingers. The coppery scent confirmed my fears. Blood, and fresh. I stood up quickly, every sense on high alert. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. I unclipped my radio again. "Dispatch, I've found signs of a possible attack. Abandoned backpack and blood at my location. Request immediate backup and medical assistance." "Copy that, Nolan. Backup is en route. ETA 20 minutes. What's your situation?" I scanned the area, noting a faint trail of disturbed vegetation leading deeper into the woods. "I've got a potential blood trail heading north. Given the earlier distress call, we may have an injured hiker out here. I'm going to follow it." "Negative, Thorne. Wait for backup." I knew the smart move was to stay put, but the thought of someone out there hurt and alone made the decision for me. "Can't wait, dispatch. If someone's injured, they might not have 20 minutes. I'm proceeding with caution. We'll radio in at 5-minute intervals." Ignoring the protests from dispatch, I clicked off the radio and began to follow the trail. With each step deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. The shadow seemed to move at the corner of my vision, and more than once I spun around, certain I had heard footsteps behind me. The trail led to the edge of a small ravine, maybe 30 feet deep. At the bottom, I could make out a figure sprawled motionless on the rocky ground. My breath caught in my throat as I carefully made my way down the steep slope, loose stones skittering away under my boots. As I approached, the details became clearer, and my stomach churned. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s, his clothes torn and saturated with blood. I knelt beside him, fingers pressed to his neck, searching for a pulse I already knew I wouldn't find. His skin was cool to the touch, eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy above. The wounds covering his body made me recoil. Deep gashes ran across his chest and arms, the edges ragged and uneven. This was no fall. The injuries were vicious, brutal, but not like any animal attack I'd ever seen. The cuts were too precise, almost methodical in their placement. A twig snapped somewhere above me, the sound like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I spun around, hand instinctively going to the knife at my belt. Across the ravine, something moved between the trees. A flash of movement too quick to follow. It was large. That much I could tell, but its gait was wrong. Not the lumbering of a bear or the lithe movements of a mountain lion. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vastness of the forest. "This is Park Ranger Thorne. Is someone there?" No response came, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I fumbled for my radio again, eyes never leaving the spot where I'd seen the movement. "Dispatch, this is Thorne. I found a victim at the bottom of a ravine, approximately half a mile north of the backpack site. Adult male, multiple lacerations, no vital signs." I swallowed hard before continuing. "The wounds are unusual, not consistent with any wildlife in the area, and I've got movement up here, something big." "Understood, Nolan," came the reply, tinged with concern. "Backup is 10 minutes out. Get to high ground and stay put. Do not engage." I knew I should listen. Every instinct, every bit of training told me to climb out of this ravine and wait for help. But curiosity and a sense of duty pushed me forward. If there was something dangerous out here, something that had done this to a man, it needed to be found, contained, before it could hurt anyone else. With a final glance at the victim, I began to make my way up the opposite side of the ravine, towards where I'd seen the movement. The forest grew denser, the canopy overhead knitting together to block out most of the sunlight. Shadows deepened, and sounds became muffled. Ahead, barely visible through the undergrowth, I spotted the dark maw of a cave entrance. Tracks led inside, large clawed prints unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were fresh, the disturbed soil still damp. I hesitated at the threshold, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. But the thought of that man in the ravine, of the terror in those screams I'd heard, steeled my resolve. I drew my knife, a meager defense but better than nothing, clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing a shallow cave, its walls slick with moisture and covered in a thick layer of moss. The air was heavy, filled with a stench that made my eyes water. The cloying sweetness of decay mingled with something else, something acrid and alien. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw them. Bones, scattered across the cave floor in careless piles. Some were clearly animal, deer, maybe a bear, but others. My throat constricted as I recognized the unmistakable curve of a human skull, bits of flesh still clinging to yellowed bone. Among the older remains lay a more recent victim, a woman, her face frozen in a rictus of terror, limbs contorted at unnatural angles. She couldn't have been dead for more than a day or two. Before I could process the horror of the scene, a low hiss echoed from the depths of the cave. I swung my flashlight towards the sound, and in that moment, I saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. It resembled a massive wolverine, but stood upright on powerful hind legs, easily 7 feet tall. Its fur was patchy, revealing sinewy muscles and mottled gray skin beneath. Long, wickedly curved claws extended from its hands, dripping with some viscous fluid. But it was the eyes that struck me most, intelligent, calculating, and filled with an otherworldly hunger. I stumbled backward, my back pressing against the damp cave wall. The creature watched me, its head tilted in an almost quizzical manner, as if studying my reaction. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it lunged. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as its claws barely missed me. Pain exploded in my arm where one talon had grazed the skin. The creature's momentum carried it past me, giving me a precious second to scramble towards the cave entrance. Bursting into the open forest, I ran. Behind me, I heard the creature's enraged shriek, a sound that sent icy tendrils of fear down my spine. I weaved through the trees, ducking under low-hanging branches and vaulting over fallen logs. The thing pursued, its movements unnaturally fast and agile for its size. My lungs burned, legs heavy with exhaustion, but terror kept me moving. I spotted a massive fallen oak ahead, its trunk creating a natural barrier. With the last reserves of my strength, I vaulted over it, hoping to buy myself some time. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as the creature tore through the obstacle as if it were made of twigs. Desperation clouding my judgment, I fumbled for my radio. "Back up," I gasped into the receiver. "I need immediate assistance. Unknown creature, extremely aggressive, pursuing me north of the ravine." "We're 2 minutes out, Nolan," came the staticky reply. "Hang tight." 2 minutes. It might as well have been 2 hours. The trees began to thin, and with horror, I realized I was approaching the edge of a cliff, overlooking the churning waters of the Blackwater River far below. Trapped between the monster and a 100-foot drop, I turned to face my pursuer. The creature approached slowly now, almost lazily, as if savoring the moment. Its eyes gleamed with a predatory intelligence that chilled me to my core. I glanced around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a loose stone, hefting its weight. "Come on," I shouted, more to psych myself up than anything else. The creature snarled, lips peeling back to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. It charged. At the last second, I sidestepped, swinging the stone with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and the creature stumbled, momentarily stunned. But my victory was short-lived. Before I could press my advantage, it recovered, slashing out with those deadly claws. White-hot pain exploded across my leg as they connected, and I fell hard onto my back. The creature loomed over me, ready to deliver the killing blow. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. A gunshot rang out, the sound echoing across the cliffside. My eyes flew open to see the creature recoiling, dark blood oozing from a wound in its shoulder. I looked over to see Deputy Hayes, his rifle aimed steadily at the monster. He was flanked by 2 other officers, their weapons trained on the beast. "Get down," Hayes shouted. I rolled to the side as they opened fire in unison. The creature shrieked, a sound of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very air. It staggered under the barrage, inching closer to the cliff's edge. With a final, piercing glare in my direction, it turned and leaped. We rushed to the edge, watching in disbelief as it plummeted into the churning river below, disappearing beneath the white-capped surface. Hayes helped me to my feet, his face pale with shock. "You all right, Thorne?" I grimaced, clutching my bleeding leg. "I've been better. What the hell was that thing?" He shook his head, eyes still fixed on the river below. "I don't know, but I've got a feeling this isn't over." As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had happened crashed over me. The bodies in the cave, the horrific wounds, the impossible creature. It all seemed like a nightmare. But the pain in my leg and the haunted looks on my colleagues' faces told me it was all too real. The forest, once a place of peace and refuge, now held an undercurrent of menace. As we made our way back to the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something ancient and terrible, something that had been waiting in the shadows all along, watching and hungry. And somewhere out there, in the depths of the Monongahela National Forest, I knew it was still alive, biding its time until it could strike again. The days following the incident passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. I sat in the sterile confines of the ranger station's small infirmary, wincing as the doctor cleaned and stitched the gashes on my leg. "You're lucky," Dr. Reeves muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Whatever did this just missed your femoral artery. A couple inches to the left, and we'd be having a very different conversation." I nodded absently, my mind still replaying the events in the forest. The creature's eyes, intelligent and filled with malice, haunted my thoughts. "Any idea what could have caused these wounds?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dr. Reeves sighed, setting aside her suture kit. "Officially, I'm putting it down as a bear attack. Unofficially?" She met my gaze, her expression troubled. "I've never seen lacerations quite like these. Too precise for a bear, too large for a mountain lion. And the spacing." She shook her head. "It doesn't match any predator native to these parts." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. Deputy Hayes entered, looking as haggard as I felt. "How you holding up, Thorne?" "I'll live," I replied, attempting a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Any news?" Hayes ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "We've got search teams combing the river and surrounding areas. No sign of whatever that thing was. But we did find the cave." My stomach clenched at the memory. "And?" "It's bad, Nolan. Forensics team identified at least 7 victims, maybe more. Some of the remains are years old. We're dealing with a serial killer here." I shook my head vehemently. "That was no human, Hayes. You saw it yourself." "I saw something I can't explain," he admitted. "But let's be realistic here, there's no such thing as monsters." Dr. Reeves cleared her throat. "I hate to interrupt, but Nolan needs rest. You can continue this discussion tomorrow." Hayes nodded, turning to leave. At the door, he paused. "Get some sleep, Thorne. We've got a long few days ahead of us." As the door closed behind him, I leaned back on the examination table, closing my eyes. But sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares of dark caves and glinting claws. A week passed, and life in the small community near the national forest took on an air of nervous tension. Hiking trails were closed, campgrounds evacuated. The official story, a rogue bear responsible for a series of attacks, did little to quell the unease that seemed to permeate the town. I found myself on mandatory leave, my wounded leg and the traumatic nature of the incident keeping me off active duty. But inactivity only made the memories more vivid, the questions more pressing. Late one evening, a knock at my cabin door startled me from a fitful doze. I opened it cautiously to find an elderly man standing on my porch, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ranger Thorne?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. I nodded, studying him warily. "Can I help you?" He glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if he'd been followed. "I heard you've encountered something unusual in the forest. May I come in? There are things you need to know." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He settled into a chair at my small kitchen table, his gnarled hands clasped before him. "My name is Joseph Redfeather," he began. "My people have lived in these mountains for countless generations. We know its secrets, its hidden places, and its dangers." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What kind of dangers?" Redfeather's dark eyes met mine, filled with an intensity that made me shiver. "The creature you faced is known to us as a Wendigo, an ancient evil, born of dark desires and insatiable hunger." "A Wendigo?" I repeated skeptically. "That's just an old legend." He shook his head sadly. "All legends have their roots in truth, Ranger Thorne. The Wendigo is very real and very dangerous. It was once human, transformed by greed and malice into something monstrous." I thought back to the intelligence I'd seen in the creature's eyes, the almost human way it had studied me before attacking. "Why did it come after me?" "You disrupted its lair, took what it considered its own," Redfeather explained. "The bodies you found were its trophies. By interfering, you became its new target. A chill ran down my spine. Is it gone? The old man sighed heavily. For now, perhaps, but such evils have a way of returning. You must be vigilant, Ranger Thorn. And remember, not all that is lost should be found. As he stood to leave, I called after him. Wait, why are you telling me all this? Redfeather paused at the door, a faint, sad smile on his lips. Consider it a warning, and a gift. Knowledge is power, especially against the darkness that lurks in these woods. Long after he had gone, I sat at my table, mind reeling. Part of me wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had veered into territory I was ill-equipped to navigate. Weeks passed without incident. The forest, once a source of comfort, now felt alien and threatening. But as the days grew shorter and autumn painted the trees in vibrant hues, a semblance of normalcy began to return to the park. I was cleared for duty, my physical wounds healed even as the mental scars remained. My first day back on patrol, I found myself approaching the area where I'd first heard those terrible screams. The forest was quiet, peaceful even, belying the horrors it had witnessed. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came across a group of campers setting up in a restricted area. My ranger instincts kicked in, momentarily overriding my unease. Afternoon, folks, I called out, forcing a smile. I'm afraid this area is off limits for camping. A woman with short red hair stepped forward, looking chagrined. Oh, we didn't see any signs. Sorry about that, Ranger. Thorn, I supplied. No worries. There's a designated site about 2 miles east of here. Much better views of the valley, too. As the group began to pack up their gear, a bearded man in his 30s approached me, his expression curious. Say, Ranger Thorn, you ever see anything strange out here? I felt my smile falter. Strange how? He grinned, oblivious to my discomfort. Well, we heard some stories in town about some kind of creature the locals are calling the Shadow Beast. Thought it might make for some good campfire tales, you know. I forced a chuckle, hoping it sounded more natural than it felt. Sounds like someone's been telling tall tales. Trust me, the forest has plenty to offer without imaginary monsters. The campers soon headed off towards the designated site, their laughter echoing through the trees. I continued my patrol, the encounter leaving me unsettled. The Shadow Beast. Was that what people were calling it now? How long before rumor and speculation drew thrill seekers and monster hunters to the park? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I made my way back to the ranger station. The comforting lights of the building came into view, and with them, a figure waiting on the porch. Deputy Hayes straightened as I approached, a brown paper bag in his hand. Thought you could use this after your first day back? He said, holding out the bag. The rich aroma of coffee and something sweet wafted from within. Thanks, I said, genuinely grateful. How's the investigation going? Hayes sighed, leaning against the railing. Officially? Closed. No evidence, no leads. The higher-ups are calling it an isolated incident, probably a bear that's long gone by now. I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. I know, Nolan. I was there too. But what are we supposed to tell people? That there's some kind of monster lurking in the woods? We'd cause a panic. I nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even as it chafed against my sense of duty. So we just... What? Pretend it never happened? We stay vigilant, Hayes said firmly. Keep our eyes open, protect the people who come here, and hope to God we never see anything like that again. As night settled over the forest, I sat on the porch of the station, nursing a cup of coffee and lost in thought. The events of the past weeks lingered at the edges of my mind, a constant nagging presence. But for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of purpose returning. Maybe Hayes was right. We couldn't change what had happened, couldn't explain it in any way that made sense, but we could be prepared, watchful. And if the forest had more mysteries or horrors in store, well, I'd be here, ready to face them. The coffee warmed my hands as a cool breeze rustled through the trees. In the distance, an owl hooted, a reminder that life in the forest went on, oblivious to the concerns of humans. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar scents of pine and earth fill my lungs. Whatever was out there, whatever secrets the Monongahela held, this was still my home, and I'd do whatever it took to protect it. As autumn deepened into winter, a heavy blanket of snow transformed the forest into a silent, white wonderland. The quiet beauty of the landscape almost made it possible to forget the horrors of that fateful day. Almost. I threw myself into my work, patrolling even the most remote trails, always watchful for any sign of the creature's return. But as weeks turned to months with no incidents, I began to wonder if perhaps it had all been some terrible hallucination, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. It was on one of these patrols, on a crisp December morning, that I stumbled upon something that shattered my fragile peace of mind. I had ventured far off the main trails, following the meandering path of a half-frozen stream. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in the hushed forest. As I rounded a bend, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There, etched deep into the bark of an ancient oak, was a symbol. A twisted, inhuman figure that seemed to writhe even in its static form. It was crude but unmistakable, and terrifyingly familiar. I had seen this same mark in the cave where I had first encountered the creature. With trembling fingers, I reached out to touch the carving. The cuts were old, the edges smoothed by time and weather. This was no recent vandalism, but something that had been here for years, perhaps decades. As I examined the tree more closely, I noticed other fainter markings. Words in a language I didn't recognize, symbols that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. And there, barely visible beneath a layer of lichen, a date. 1891. My mind reeled. If this marking was as old as it appeared, it meant that whatever we had encountered in the forest was not some new threat, but something that had been here for generations. How many other incidents had there been over the years, covered up or dismissed as animal attacks or tragic accidents? I fumbled for my camera, snapping pictures of the tree and its unsettling decorations. As I did so, a sound carried on the wind made me freeze. A long, low howl that was neither wolf nor coyote. It echoed through the trees, setting my nerves on edge. Without conscious thought, I found myself running, slipping and sliding through the snow as I made my way back to more familiar terrain. Only when the ranger station came into view did I slow, my lungs burning from the cold air. Inside, I slumped into my chair, staring at the images on my camera's display. What did it all mean? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information? I thought back to Joseph Redfeather's words. Not all that is lost should be found. But now that I had found this, could I simply ignore it? As darkness fell, I made a decision. I wouldn't report this officially, not yet. But I needed to know more. If this threat had been here for over a century, there had to be records, stories, something that could help me understand what we were dealing with. Tomorrow I would begin my search. For now, I stared out the window at the moonlit forest, wondering what other secrets lay hidden beneath the snowy blanket of winter. The county library was a small, unassuming building that smelled of old paper and dust. I had taken a rare day off, ostensibly to run errands in town. In reality, I was here to dig into the area's history, searching for any clues that might shed light on the markings I had found. The librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Patel, seemed thrilled to have someone interested in local history. She led me to a back room filled with archives and county records, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Not many people come in looking for this stuff," she said, pulling out several heavy, leather-bound volumes. "What exactly are you researching, Ranger Thorne?" I hesitated, not wanting to reveal too much. Just unexplained incidents in the park, animal attacks, missing hikers, that sort of thing. Mrs. Patel's smile faded slightly. "Oh my. Well, I'm afraid you'll find plenty of that. These mountains have their share of tragedies." For hours I pored over old newspapers, county records, and handwritten accounts from early settlers. Most of it was mundane, reports of harsh winters, crop yields, the occasional bear sighting. But as I dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades there would be a rash of disappearances or unusual animal attacks. The reports were often vague, with phrases like partially consumed remains and unexplained markings that made my skin crawl. And always these incidents seemed to cluster around particularly harsh winters or times of scarcity. One account, from a trapper in 1943, caught my attention. Found Joe's cabin yesterday. Door torn clean off its hinges. Inside was, I ain't got words for it. Like something had been playing with what was left of him. Saw tracks in the snow leading away. Bigger than any bear, walking on two legs. I'm getting out of these mountains. Some things ain't meant to be hunted. I was so engrossed in my reading that I didn't notice Mrs. Patel approaching until she spoke, making me jump. Find anything interesting? She asked, peering at the papers spread before me. I nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. It's fascinating stuff. Hey, do you know if there are any local historians or folklorists I could talk to? Someone who might know more about the area's legends? Mrs. Patel thought for a moment. Well, there's old Dr. Harrison. Retired now, but he used to teach anthropology over at the community college. Bit of an eccentric, but he knows more about local lore than anyone else around here. I jotted down the address she gave me, thanking her for her help. As I gathered my notes to leave, a newspaper clipping from 1972 caught my eye. The headline read, "Park Ranger Missing, Presumed Dead After Animal Attack." Below was a photo of a man in a ranger uniform, his face eerily similar to my own. The name beneath the picture made my blood run cold. Thomas Thorne. With shaking hands, I showed the clipping to Mrs. Patel. This man, was he? She squinted at the image, then looked at me with surprise. Why, that must be your grandfather. I remember when this happened. Such a tragedy. They never did find his body. I stumbled out of the library, my mind reeling. My grandfather had been a ranger here, and he had encountered, what? The same creature that had nearly killed me? Why had my family never spoken of this? As I drove towards Dr. Harrison's house, the pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place. But with each answer came a dozen new questions. Whatever was happening in these mountains, it was clear that my connection to it ran deeper than I had ever imagined. Dr. Harrison's house was a cluttered Victorian at the edge of town, its paint peeling and yard overgrown. As I approached the front door, I could hear the faint strains of classical music drifting from within. My knock was answered by a man who looked every bit the eccentric academic. Wild white hair, thick glasses, and a cardigan that had seen better days. Yes? He asked, peering at me suspiciously. Dr. Harrison, I'm Ranger Nolan Thorne. I was hoping to talk to you about some local history. His eyes lit up with interest. Ah, a fellow seeker of knowledge. Come in, come in. The interior of the house was as chaotic as its owner, every surface covered with books, papers, and curious artifacts. Dr. Harrison led me to a cluttered study, clearing a stack of papers from a chair for me to sit. Now then, he said, settling into a worn leather armchair. What aspect of our fair region's history interests you? I hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject. Finally, I decided on directness. I'm interested in local legends, specifically those related to unexplained creatures in the forest. Harrison's bushy eyebrows shot up. Ah, he said softly. You've seen it, haven't you? My surprise must have shown on my face because he chuckled. Don't look so shocked, young man. You're not the first to come asking about our resident monster, though it's been some years. For the next hour, I listened as Harrison spun a tale that both chilled my blood and confirmed my worst fears. The creature, which he too called a Wendigo, had been a part of local lore for centuries. The native tribes knew of it, he explained. They had rituals, wards to keep it at bay. But when the settlers came, they brought with them a new kind of hunger, for land, for resources, for power. According to Harrison, the Wendigo was drawn to that hunger, feeding on it and growing stronger. It's a parasite of sorts, he mused, corrupting those with the greatest appetites, turning them into something other. I thought of the intelligence I'd seen in the creature's eyes, the almost human way it had studied me. So it was human once. Harrison nodded gravely. And in some twisted way, perhaps it still is. That's what makes it so dangerous. It thinks, it plans, and it remembers those who wrong it. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled Joseph Redfeather's warning. "I found some markings in the forest," I said, pulling out my phone to show him the photos. "Do you know what they mean?" The old professor's face paled as he examined the images. "Where did you find these?" he demanded. I described the location, and Harrison's expression grew even more troubled. "That area has been a focal point for incidents, for generations. Your grandfather—" "You knew him?" I interrupted, surprised. Harrison nodded sadly. "Thomas was a good man, too curious for his own good, much like yourself. He was getting close to the truth when he disappeared." "What truth?" I pressed. The old man sighed heavily. "That the Wendigo isn't just some mindless beast. It's tied to this land, to the very essence of the forest. And there are those who would use its power for their own ends." He stood abruptly, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. From it he retrieved a small, leather-bound journal. "This was your grandfather's," he said, holding it out to me. "He left it with me for safekeeping in case something happened to him." I took the journal with trembling hands. "Why are you telling me all this?" Harrison's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Because knowledge is power, Ranger Thorne, and you're going to need all the power you can get if you're to face what's coming." As I left Harrison's house, my head spinning with revelations, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped onto a path from which there was no return. Winter deepened, blanketing the forest in silence and snow. I threw myself into my work, patrolling even the most remote trails with renewed vigilance. But always, in the back of my mind, the weight of my grandfather's journal and the knowledge Dr. Harrison had shared pressed down on me. I read the journal in bits and pieces, often late at night when sleep eluded me. My grandfather's neat handwriting filled page after page with observations, theories, and increasingly disturbing encounters. He had been tracking the Wendigo's movements, trying to understand its nature and purpose. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, was particularly chilling. "I'm close to understanding, but I fear the knowledge may come at too high a price. The markings, the symbols, they're not just territorial signs. They're a language, a means of communication. But who is the Wendigo talking to? And more importantly, who is answering?" One bitterly cold morning in late January, I received a call from dispatch. A group of hikers had failed to return from an overnight trip. As I geared up for the search, a sense of foreboding settled over me. The trail the hikers had taken led deep into the heart of the forest, near the area where I had first encountered the Wendigo. As I snowshoed through the silent woods, every snapping twig and shifting shadow set my nerves on edge. I was nearing the last known location of the hikers when I saw it, a flash of color against the white snow. Drawing closer, my heart sank. It was a torn piece of fabric from a high-end hiking jacket, stained dark with what I knew instinctively was blood. As I surveyed the area, the signs of a struggle became clear. The snow was churned up, trees scraped and broken. And there, carved fresh into the trunk of a massive pine, was a symbol I recognized from my grandfather's journal. A crack of a branch behind me made me spin around, hand flying to my sidearm. But instead of the monster I half expected, I found myself face to face with Joseph Redfeather. "You shouldn't be here alone, Ranger Thorne," he said, his weathered face grave. "I'm doing my job," I replied, trying to calm my racing heart. "There are missing hikers." Redfeather shook his head sadly. "They're beyond our help now. But you still have a choice." "What do you mean?" The old man's dark eyes met mine. A storm is coming, Nolan. One that has been brewing for generations. The hunger is growing stronger, and the barriers that have held it in check are weakening. I thought of the symbols, the strange markings that seemed to be appearing more frequently. What can we do? We prepare, Redfeather said firmly. We gather allies, those who remember the old ways, and we hope that when the time comes it will be enough. As if in response to his words, a howl echoed through the forest, a sound of hunger and rage that seemed to shake the very air around us. Redfeather and I exchanged a look of grim understanding. The peace of the past months had been an illusion. Whatever had been set in motion that day in the cave was far from over. It was, I realized with a mixture of fear and determination, only the beginning. As we made our way back to the ranger station, I felt the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. My grandfather had given his life trying to uncover the truth. Now, it fell to me to finish what he had started. The forest, once a place of solace and beauty, now loomed dark and forbidding. But it was still my home, still the land I had sworn to protect. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever horrors lurked in the shadows, I would face them. For in the end, that's what being a ranger, what being a thorn, was all about. Standing as a bulwark between the darkness and the light, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As the sun set behind the snow-capped mountains, casting long shadows across the land, I made a silent vow. I would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. And when the storm finally broke, I would be ready. The forest road ran out of pavement 11 miles before it ran out of forest, and by the time I reached the Ashwater Ranger Station, my truck was wearing a second coat of gray dust. I parked in the turnaround and let the engine tick itself quiet. Nobody came out. A wind moved through the pines above the roofline and made a sound like water running somewhere underground. The station was smaller than the photograph on the district website. One story, cedar shingles gone silver with age, a stovepipe leaning slightly east, and a porch with 2 chairs on it that faced the trees instead of the road. Somebody had nailed a strip of tin over a hole in the siding and never gotten around to painting it. Behind the building, the ridge climbed steeply into black timber, and above that, so far up it looked like a toy, the fire lookout tower stood on its 4 steel legs with its windows catching the last of the sun. I had come 900 miles to sit in a place like this. That was the entire plan. No neighbors sharing a wall, no pager, no supervisor asking me gently in that voice they use whether I was ready to come back on shift. Just a paycheck, a bunk, and about 400,000 acres of nothing between me and anybody who knew my name. I got out and pulled my duffel from the passenger seat and stood in the smell of hot dust and pine pitch. The door opened. The woman who came out was in her 60s, short and thick through the shoulders, gray hair cut blunt at the jaw, wearing a district polo washed so many times the logo had gone to a ghost. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head and a mug in her hand that said, "World's Okayest Fisherman." "Vance," she said. "Nora Vance." "Yes, ma'am." "Meredith Kilgore, Mary." "Don't ma'am me. I'm not that old and you're not that young." She looked me over the way you look at a load before you decide how to lift it. My boots were new. My jacket still had the fold creases in it. She saw both. "Come in. We'll do paperwork later. There's something we do first." Inside smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the sweet sour must of old paper. 2 desks, a radio console with a hand mic on a coiled cord, a wood stove with a kettle on it, a kitchenette with 3 mugs drying on a towel. The whole west wall was maps, layered 3 deep, the top one stuck with colored pins and annotated in at least 4 different handwritings. Somebody had circled a section of drainage in red and written a date beside it. 1994. Mary set her mug down and took a laminated card off a nail by the radio. She held it out to me without a word. It was about the size of a diner menu. The lamination had gone yellow at the corners and cloudy where fingers had worn it. At the top, in typewriter capitals, Black Pine District. Station protocols, memorized before first shift. Below that, 7 numbered lines. I read the first one and stopped. 1. If you hear your name called from off trail, do not answer. Note the time. If it is called a third time, walk out the way you came in and do not run. I looked up. Mary was watching me with no expression at all. Keep going, she said. 2. The lookout stairs are 41 steps. Count them every ascent out loud. If you reach 42, do not open the door. Descend, count on the way down, and radio the station before you try again. 3. Black Pine District has 5 stations. Between Oro 200 and Oro 400, the repeater will sometimes carry traffic from Station 6. Do not respond. Do not log it. Do not repeat aloud anything Station 6 says. 4. At dusk, do not hold eye contact with anything standing on the far bank of moving water. Break contact by looking down at your own feet, not by turning your head. 5. If you find an occupied campsite with a live fire and no people, do not extinguish the fire. Add wood. Leave the site by the trail you came in on. 6. If an animal is standing in the road and does not move for your horn or your high beams, reverse. Do not steer around it. Do not get out. 7. Any ranger you meet in the field who is not on the duty board, ask them the day of the week. If they answer without pausing, they're ours. If they pause, end the conversation, walk, and do not go back to your vehicle until you've walked at least 10 minutes in the wrong direction. I read the whole thing twice. Then I laughed. It came out of me before I could decide anything about it, one short, ugly bark of a laugh, and I heard how it sounded in that room and wished I hadn't. Sorry, I said. Is this okay? Is this a thing you do? To the new one? Is that what it looks like? It looks like a hazing card. Mary took her mug back off the desk and drank from it. It looks like a hazing card, she agreed. That's how everybody gets through the first reading of it. That's fine. I don't need you to believe it today. But you need me to follow it. Every line, every time. Whether or not it makes sense, whether or not you're tired, whether or not there's somebody standing in front of you telling you it's stupid. She set the mug down again. Especially then. I turned the card over. The back was blank except for a line of handwriting at the bottom, blue ink, small and cramped, added under the lamination at some later date because the plastic there was a different thickness. Rule 8. Waiting is not the same as refusing. What's Rule 8? You'll figure that one out on your own or you won't. She said it flatly without cruelty, the way you'd tell somebody the well water runs rusty for the first 10 seconds. Everybody does. I want to explain the person I was on that first afternoon, because otherwise none of what follows will make sense. For 11 years I ran a medic unit out of Boise. You learn a specific reflex in that job and it burns itself into you at a level below thinking. Something screams, you move toward it. Somebody says, help me. You are already crossing the road. I have gone into a house that was actively on fire because a woman on the sidewalk said her mother was inside, and her mother was not inside. And I did not regret it then, and I don't now, because the arithmetic is simple. You go, or you spend the rest of your life being the person who didn't. In February, we took a call at 3:40 a.m., and I made a decision that was defensible in every review that examined it, and a 19-year-old named Kyle Ostrander died anyway. Everybody told me the decision was correct. My partner told me. The review board told me. The counselor the department sent me to told me twice a week for 2 months. And every one of them was right, and it changed nothing, because the thing that was broken in me wasn't guilt over the decision. It was that I no longer trusted my own reflex. It had always been the one thing about me I never had to check. So I quit, and I took a seasonal ranger job in a district so remote that the nearest hospital was 2 hours by road and 3 by helicopter, and I told myself this was rest. That is the woman who stood in the Ashwater station holding a laminated card and deciding, privately, that Meredith Kilgore was a lonely old woman with a superstition problem, and that I would be polite about it. I have thought about that a great deal since. She gave me the tour in about 9 minutes. Bunk room in the back with 2 beds and a window that didn't open. Bathroom with a water heater that had to be lit with a match. Kitchenette, wood stove, a generator shed out back with a fuel log on a clipboard, radio console, and she made me practice the call signs until I had them. Ashwater was Black Pine 2. Mary was 2-1. I was 2-3. Who's 2-2? Danny Farrow, seasonal, second year. He's up on Cutbank doing trailhead counts back tomorrow. He's 23 and he'll talk your ear off about mushrooms. She hung the mic back on its hook. He follows the card. He's never once asked me why. It's the best quality he's got. There was a duty board on the wall by the door. A whiteboard with a grid drawn on it in permanent marker. 3 names: Kilgore, Farrow, Vance. Beside each name, a column for location and a column for back by, filled in with dry erase in Mary's block capitals. You write on that board every time you leave, she said. Where and when, not approximately. If you're going to be past your time, you call it in and I change it. If I can't reach you and you're 40 minutes past, I start calling other people. That's not paranoia, that's just the job, that part they do everywhere. And the other part? The other part they don't do anywhere. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the metal filing cabinet under the maps. It was full, front to back, of manila folders packed so tight she had to work 2 fingers in to lift the first one. You want the sales pitch or you want to skip it? I'd like to know what I'm agreeing to. That's not the same as wanting it. But she took out the folder anyway and laid it open on the desk. The first page was an incident report on a form the agency had stopped using in the 90s, typed on an actual typewriter, with a photograph paper clipped to the corner. The photo was a man in his 40s in a uniform shirt, squinting, standing in front of a truck with one boot up on the bumper. Aaron Pike, Mary said. 22 years in this district. He trained me. In September of '09, he took a report of a fire ring smoldering at an empty site up Weatherby Creek, and he did the responsible thing, and he put it out, and he policed the site, and he wrote a very good report about it, and I have that report right there. She tapped the folder without looking down. 11 days later, his truck was found at the Weatherby trailhead, locked, keys in the cup holder, radio on the passenger seat with the battery still good. We ran that drainage with 60 people and 2 dogs and a helicopter for 9 days. You didn't find him. We found his hat, 4 miles up the wrong side of a ridge he had no reason to be on. And in March, 6 months later, 3 separate parties on 3 separate days reported meeting a ranger on the Weatherby Trail who gave them directions to a campground that has never existed. She closed the folder. 2 of those parties described him well enough that I could have picked him out of 100 men. The third one was a school teacher from Missoula who asked him what day it was because her phone had died and she'd lost track. I waited. He didn't know, Mary said. The room was very quiet. Out back, the generator wasn't running and I could hear the pines doing their thing again, that underwater sound. You understand I can't do anything with that, I said, carefully. As information. I know you can't. I'm not calling you a liar. I didn't think you were. She slid the drawer shut with her knee. Here's all I want, Vance. I want you to follow a laminated card for 1 season. It costs you nothing. It's 7 lines. If at the end of the season you think I'm a crazy old woman who scared herself sick out here, you'll go home and you'll tell that story at parties, and I genuinely, sincerely, do not care. She picked up her mug, found it empty, and set it down. Everybody in that drawer thought the cost of following it was too high to be worth it. Every single one. That's the only thing they all had in common. The first 8 days were a job. That's the part nobody tells you about places like Black Pine. It is overwhelmingly, gloriously boring. I cleaned 2 vault toilets a day. I cut a downed subalpine fir off the Cutbank trail with a crosscut saw because it was wilderness, and we couldn't use a chainsaw. And it took Danny and me 4 hours, and I have never in my life slept better than I did that night. I counted cars at trailheads. Danny Farrow came down off Cutbank on my 2nd day, a rangy kid with a sunburn line across his forehead and an actual hand lens on a lanyard around his neck. Mary was right about the mushrooms. On the 3rd day, driving back from Loon Meadow with him, I brought up the card. I did it lightly. I was trying to be kind, actually. I had it in my head that Mary had spooked this kid, and that he was too polite to say so, and that maybe I could give him permission to think it was silly. He didn't take it. "Yeah, it's real," he said, and reached over to adjust the heater vent. "Danny, you asked. I asked if you believed it. That was a yes or no question, and you gave me a... That was the tone people use about the weather." He thought about it, driving. "Okay," he said. "My grandfather logged this drainage. My dad ran a hotshot crew out of Hamilton for 19 years. I've had like 4 generations of people telling me stories about this country, and 90% of it is stuff guys made up to scare each other in bunkhouses, and I know the difference. This isn't that." He shrugged. "It's 7 things. 2 of them I've never had come up. 3 of them cost me nothing. 1 of them cost me a bad night once. That's the whole price. Why would I not pay it? Because it isn't true? Sure. Or because it is." He glanced over. "Look, you're a medic. When you carried gloves, was that because you were sure the guy had Hep C?" I didn't have a good answer to that, so I looked out the window and let it go, and I thought about it more than I let on. Here's the honest truth about those first 8 days, though, and it's the part I have the hardest time explaining to people who have only been in a national forest on a Saturday afternoon in July. Nothing happened, and something was wrong. Not dramatically. I want to be precise, because precision is the only thing that makes any of this worth writing down. It was that 100 small readings came in slightly off. At night, the timber above the station made noise the way timber does, and once or twice a week the noise stopped. Not faded, stopped, all of it, the way a room goes quiet when somebody walks in. It would last 20 seconds and then start again. Birds did that. It's a normal thing birds do. But they did it a lot. Twice I found tracks on the 2-track behind the generator shed that I could not identify, and I am good at tracks. I spent my childhood following my uncle around the Owyhees. These were none of those, and they weren't a bad print of any of those either. They were consistent. They came from the timber, went to about 9 feet from the back door, and turned around, and there was no return line. And on my 6th night, going out to shut down the generator, I stood on the back step with the door open behind me and the light spilling out around my legs, and I had the absolutely uncomplicated animal certainty that I was being looked at by something at the tree line. Not watched. Looked at. Considered. I stood there for a long moment with my hand on the doorframe, and I did not go get the flashlight, and I did not go look. And I told myself that was because it was cold. Rule 3 came for me on my 9th night. Mary had gone down to Hamilton for a supply run and a district meeting, and would be back the following afternoon, which left me on the station overnight for the first time alone. Danny was up at the Cutbank cabin. She wrote both of those things on the duty board before she left in her block capitals, and stood looking at the board for a second like she was reading it back to herself. "Radio's on all night," she said. "Volume stays up. You sleep with the door open so you can hear it." "Understood." "Vance." She had her keys in her hand. 02 to 04. "I remember the rule. Say it back." I felt about 14 years old. "Do not respond. Do not log it. Do not repeat aloud anything Station 6 says." "Okay," she said, and left. And I watched her taillights go down through the switchbacks for a long time because you could see them a long way from that porch. I woke at 2:14 because the radio hissed. Not traffic, just the carrier opening. That soft rush of a squelch breaking somewhere, which is a sound I had heard 400 times in 9 days and never once woken up for. I lay in the bunk with my eyes open in the dark and listened to it hold for 4 seconds and close. Then a voice said, "Black Pine 6, radio check." It was a woman's voice. Calm, bored, mid-30s maybe, with the slightly clipped delivery that everybody develops on a mic. It was the most ordinary sound in the world. I sat up. I want to be very clear about what was going on in my head at that moment, because I've had a lot of time to take it apart. I did not think ghost. I thought, Mary has a piece of information wrong. There is a 6th station, or there was one, or somebody's using an old call sign, or this is a crew from another district on our repeater, or it's a couple of kids with a handheld from a hardware store, which is a thing that happens constantly. Every one of those is more likely than anything Mary had implied. And a person is on the radio at 2 in the morning doing a check, and there is nobody answering them. Black Pine 6, radio check, she said again. Same tone. Not worried, just going through it. I got out of the bunk and walked into the office in my socks. The console's display was the only light in the room. A dim green wash over the desk and the map wall. 12 seconds. Then, Black Pine 6 radio check, anybody up? And she laughed a little at the end of it. A small, tired laugh, the kind you do at 2 in the morning when you're talking to nobody. I put my hand on the mic and I didn't pick it up. I want credit for that, honestly. It's the only thing I did right that night. I stood there with my hand on it for probably a full minute, and what stopped me wasn't belief. It was Mary standing by the door making me say it back to her, and the stubborn, ridiculous social fact that I had promised a 62-year-old woman I would do a thing. At 2:31, the carrier opened again. Ashwater 6. Everything in my chest went down about 2 inches. Ashwater 6. Nora, you awake? I had been on that district for 9 days. My name was on a duty board inside a locked building, on a personnel form in Hamilton, and in the mouths of exactly 2 people. Nora. The voice was patient. I know you're at the console. It's fine. You don't have to say anything. I just need you to write something down for me. I did not move. I have never in my life been so aware of the sound of my own breathing. Mary's coming back up the Black Pine Road tomorrow around 4, it said. Tell her not to take the shortcut at the switchback. Tell her the culvert's out. She'll believe you if you tell her. She won't believe me. There is a specific horror in being handed a piece of useful, sensible, actionable information by something that should not know your name. Because it's reasonable. It's a favor. Everything in you wants to engage with it on its own terms, to say, how do you know? To say, who is this? To say thank you. And every one of those is a door. The carrier closed. 11 seconds. Opened. Nora. I turned around and walked out of the office. I stood in the bunk room in the dark with my hands over my ears like a child, and I could still hear the shape of it through the wall. That even reasonable rhythm. My name in it twice more. At some point after 3, it stopped. I sat on the floor with my back against the bunk frame until the window turned gray, and then I made coffee and drank it on the porch in the cold, watching the light come down the far ridge, and I felt absolutely fine, which frightened me more than the night had, because here's what I did next. I went inside, and I opened the station log, and I wrote, 0214-0303. Unidentified traffic on repeater, female voice, using call sign, Black Pine 6. Referred to station personnel by name. No response given. Recommend district check for unauthorized use. I read it over. It was a good entry. It was accurate. It was professional. It was the kind of thing that gets a technician sent up to look at a repeater, and it was the correct action for any rational person in any rational world to take. Do not log it. I had a pen in my hand and a perfectly clean explanation for why this particular line of a laminated card was the one that was just superstition, and I sat there for a while with the pen and I thought, in words, this is exactly how Aaron Pike wrote a very good report about a campfire. I didn't scratch it out. Scratching it out leaves it there. I tore the page out of the logbook and I burned it in the wood stove and I wrote the day's date on the new page and under it, 0214-0303. Nothing to report. That is the first lie I ever told in an official record, and I have never once regretted it. Mary came up the road at 4:10 the next afternoon. I was splitting rounds behind the station when I heard the truck, and I came around front with the maul still in my hand and watched her park, and I did not say a single word about culverts. She got out, looked at my face, and stood there with the door open. Long night, she said. Yeah. You want to tell me? No. She nodded slowly, reached back into the cab and came out with 2 grocery bags. That's the right answer, she said, and handed me one. and we carried the supply run inside and put it away, and she never asked me again. 3 days later, I climbed the lookout for the first time. Ashwater Lookout sits on a knob at 7,400 feet, 40 minutes up a switchbacking trail from the station, and it hasn't been staffed full-time since the 80s. We used it as a repeater site and a radio dead spot fix and an excuse to get a 200-degree view of the district after lightning. There'd been a dry cell over the cut bank drainage the night before, and Mary wanted eyes on it in the morning, which is standard. You look for smoke the day after, not during. "You'll count," she said. Not a question. Out loud. Out loud. The out loud part isn't decoration. The trail up is nothing special. Pine, then subalpine fir, then that stunted, twisted stuff at the top that grows sideways out of rock. The tower is a 40-foot steel frame with a 14 by 14 cab on top, catwalk all the way around, and a staircase that switches back on itself 4 times inside the frame. I stood at the bottom with my hand on the rail and felt profoundly stupid, and then I started up. 1, 2, 3. You can't do this quietly. The steps are open steel grate, and they ring. My voice sounded thin and ridiculous coming back off the metal. 14, 15, 16. First landing. Turn. The wind up there was doing about 15, and there was a raven working the updraft on the west side, hanging in one place with its head turned, watching me count. 28. 29. Third landing. Turn. I could see the whole Weatherby drainage laid out below me now, still holding morning shadow in the bottom, and a thin haze of blue over the far ridges that was probably just moisture. 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. I put my foot on the next step, and it was there, and my hand was already coming up toward the door handle, which was right in front of me at chest height. Exactly where a door handle is when you've reached the top of a staircase. 41. There was another step above me. I stood on 41 with my hand 8 inches from the handle and looked at the step above my foot, and the landing above that and the door, which was also above that. 2 treads and a landing between me and a door that had been right in front of my face half a second earlier. I did not have any sensation of the world changing. Nothing lurched. My hand was still out in front of me. Through the cab windows I could see the underside of the roof, the corner of the old Osborne firefinder table, and one square of blue sky on the far side, and a shape between me and that square of sky, standing inside the cab, at about the height a person would be if a person were standing at the top of the stairs waiting for the door to open. It did not move. I said, 42, out loud, because my mouth was already doing it, and I have wondered ever since whether that was a mistake. Then I got out of there. I want to say I descended in a calm and orderly fashion, counting steps as instructed. What I actually did was go down that staircase with my hands sliding on both rails and my boots hitting maybe every 3rd tread, and my voice going the whole way in a flat, rapid mumble that wasn't really counting anymore. I hit the ground and kept going about 30 feet into the rocks before I stopped and turned around. The tower stood there. Steel legs, cab, catwalk, the raven now sitting on the northeast corner of the railing cleaning its beak on the rail. A staircase with 4 landings. I got the handheld off my belt and my hands were not good and it took me 2 tries. Black Pine 2, 2-3. 2-3 go. I'm at the lookout, I counted 42. There was no pause at all. Copy 42. Are you on the ground? I'm on the ground. Is the door open or closed? I looked up. Closed. Okay, walk down to the saddle where the trail bends, that's about 10 minutes, and sit down there and drink some water and don't look back up at it. I'll call you in 20. Mary, 20 minutes, Vance. Then we'll talk about anything you want. So I walked down to the saddle and sat on a rock in the sun and drank half a liter of water and shook. It's a thing bodies do. There's no shame in it, and I've seen it in people a lot tougher than me. But I'd never had it happen over something that hadn't happened. She called it 19 minutes. How are you doing? I'm fine. I wasn't, but it was becoming true again. Mary, what's in the cab? Nothing's in the cab. I was up there Tuesday, the firefinder, the stool, a case of MREs from probably 2011, and a hantavirus problem. There was something standing in it. I know, she said. I sat with that. How many times has this happened to you? I asked. 4. In 31 years. A crackle of wind on her end. She was outside, probably on the porch. First time I was maybe 2 years in, and I was a lot like you, and I did what you'd expect. You opened the door. I opened the door, she said. There was nothing in the cab, and I did my smoke check, and I came down, and I was fine, and I felt real good about myself for about 9 days. A pause, and then something that sounded like my sister called me on the station phone, and we don't have a station phone. After the tower, I stopped arguing. I didn't start believing exactly. Belief is a bigger, cleaner thing than what happened to me, and I've never gotten all the way there even now. What happened was more like the way you stop arguing with a hot stove. I still had no theory. I had no mechanism, no name, nothing I could have said in a sentence to a doctor without being asked some follow-up questions. What I had was a laminated card that had been right twice, and a rule about not needing it to make sense. I read the card again that night, properly, the way I'd read protocols when I was 23 and new and scared of doing it wrong. 3 of the 7 were about not going towards something. 2 were about not answering something. 1 was about not looking at something. 1, 5, the campfire, was about doing something for it and leaving. That's a strange pattern. If you were writing rules to protect people from an animal, you'd write about food storage and travel in groups and what to do if it charges. Every single line on that card was about interaction. Everyone described a situation where something wanted a response from a human being, and everyone told you exactly which response to withhold. Somebody had figured that out by trial and error. That was the part I couldn't stop looking at. Somewhere behind every line was a person who'd found out the other way. Rule 6 came up on a Thursday, driving back from Loon Meadow after dark. I'd stayed late helping a Boy Scout troop leader from Spokane figure out that his fuel canister was full and his stove was broken, and I was coming down the 468 road at maybe 20 with my brights on, tired, thinking about dinner. There was an elk in the road. Cow elk, no calf, standing broadside across both tracks about 60 feet ahead, head turned toward me, which is the most ordinary sight on that road. I had probably slowed for 200 elk that month. I stopped and waited, and she didn't move. I gave her a few seconds, then a light tap of the horn, which normally sends them straight into the timber. She didn't move. I flashed the brights twice. Her eyes did the thing eyes do in headlights, that flat coin-bright shine, and she stood there in the middle of the road with her head turned toward my windshield and did not move a muscle. Not an ear. Elk are never still like that. Nothing alive is still like that. Even a sleeping animal has a rhythm to it. I sat with my foot on the brake and my hands on the wheel, and I watched her not breathe. The road was wide enough there. That's the thing I keep coming back to. It was a good stretch of the 468 with a decent shoulder on the downhill side, and I could have put 2 wheels in the gravel and gone around her at walking speed with room to spare. And any reasonable person in the state of Montana would have done exactly that. I put it in reverse. Backing a truck a quarter mile down a forest road at night, on a road that drops off on one side, with your reverse lights lighting up about 11 feet of nothing behind you, is genuinely dangerous. I went slow, one arm over the seat watching the ditch line in the backup lights, and I did not look at the mirror, and I did not look at the mirror, and I did not look at the mirror. At the wide spot by the creek crossing, I got the truck turned around, and I drove 22 miles the long way around the district on the 12 and came up the Black Pine Road from the south and got to the station at 11:40 at night. Mary was still up. She had the stove going and a book open, and she looked at me over her glasses when I came in. 6, I said. Where? The 468 about a mile below the Loon Junction. What was it? A cow elk. She got up and wrote it on the calendar hanging by the radio. Just the date and 468 Loon elk in small letters, in a row of similar notations going back through the whole summer that I had never once looked at closely. You went the long way? Yeah. Good. She sat back down. It's usually deer. Once in a while it's a horse, and I've never figured out where a horse would come from up there. She picked her book back up. There's Stu. Rule 1 was 2 weeks later, in daylight, in the most beautiful place I have ever stood. I was doing a solo patrol up the Weatherby, which is the drainage where Aaron Pike went. And yes, I noticed that. And no, I didn't ask to be sent somewhere else. There's a bench up there at about 6 miles where the timber opens into a meadow with a creek running through the middle of it, and in late August the whole thing goes gold, and there are usually sandhill cranes in the wet end. It was about 2 in the afternoon. Sunlight, no wind, 70 degrees. There was a family of 4 eating lunch on a rock a quarter mile behind me on the trail. I had said hello to them 12 minutes earlier. Somebody off to my left, up in the timber, said, "Nora." I stopped walking. Here is what happens in your body. Nothing bad at first. It's your name. Your name in a friendly, ordinary voice at conversational volume from 40 yards away. Every single system you have comes online in helpful mode. Your head starts to turn, your mouth is already opening. You are, in that first instant, a person being greeted by a friend. Nora, twice. The rule doesn't say what to do at 2. It says note the time, and if it comes a third time, walk out the way you came and don't run. I looked at my watch. 2:07. I have never in my life had to work so hard to look at anything as I did to look at that watch face instead of at the tree line, and I remember that the second hand was between the 4 and the 5. 15 seconds. 20. I thought about the family on the rock behind me. I thought about how sound carries in a meadow, and about whether they had heard it and whether they'd heard a woman's name or their own. At about 30 seconds from a different position, 30 or 40 feet further up the slope, which is a distance nothing crosses silently through blowdown, the voice said, "Nora." 3. I turned around and I walked out the way I had come in, and I did not run, and that walk is the longest 6 miles of my life. The thing about not running is that it forces you to stay inside your own body. If you run, you get to be an animal for a while, and animals aren't afraid the way people are, they're just fast. Walking, you have time. You have time to hear that the timber on your left has gone quiet in a moving band that keeps pace with you, and to notice when it stops being on your left and starts being ahead of you and to the right, and to do arithmetic about how something got there. I caught up to the family after a half mile. 2 parents, 2 kids, maybe 8 and 11, packing up their lunch. "Hey," I said. "I'm heading down. There's a lot of daylight left, but I'd like company on the trail if you don't mind." The mother looked at me for about a second and a half, then she said, "Kids, boots on." She knew. I don't mean she knew anything about black pine or the card or what was in the timber. I mean she looked at a park ranger's face and made a decision in a second and a half without asking me a single question, and I have thought about that woman a lot. We walked out together. I made conversation about huckleberries. The 11-year-old told me at length about a video game. At the trailhead they got in a green minivan with Washington plates, and the mother rolled the window down and said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yes, thank you." And she nodded and drove away, and I have no idea what her name was. Then I sat in my truck in an empty parking lot in the sun and put my forehead on the steering wheel. It hadn't come out of the timber. Not once in 6 miles. It had stayed in there, 20 or 30 yards up the slope, for at least the first 4 of those miles. I could track it by the silence and twice by the sound of something taking a step and not committing to the next one. And it had never come out into the open, and it had never said my name again. That's what I told Mary that night, and it's the only time all summer I saw her look genuinely pleased with me. "You noticed," she said. "Noticed what?" "That it wouldn't cross into the open, and that it stopped talking once you didn't answer." She was cleaning a Pulaski head with a file, sitting on the porch step in the last light. That's Rule 8 territory, that is. That's the actual thing. You keep saying Rule 8. Because you're getting there, and I'm not going to spoil it. Mary, for God's sake. She kept filing. Scrape, scrape. You want the shape of it, or the whole thing? The shape. They can't make you do anything, she said. That's the shape. In 31 years, I have never once seen or heard of one of them touch a person who didn't come to it. Not one. They can't come in the door. They can't cross open ground in daylight. They can't lay a hand on you in a truck with the windows up. She turned the head over. What they can do is talk. So everything on that card is about talking. Because talking is the only weapon they've got. And the only way it works is if you answer. Aaron Pike walked up the Weatherby of his own free will, and I would bet this station he was going to help somebody. She set the file down. Everybody in that drawer went to advance. Everyone. It's a hunting method, and the bait is us being decent. The campfire was the following week, and it was Danny's call, and it's the one I think about when I want to feel good about something. We were doing a 2-day patrol up Cutbank together, and we came into an established site at Grayling Lake at about 6 in the evening, and there was a fire going in the ring. Not a smolder, a live fire, 6 inches of flame, recently fed, with a stack of split wood beside it that hadn't come from anywhere near there because there's no split wood in a wilderness area. There was a tent up, a good one, a blue 3-season with the fly on. There was a pack against a log with the lid unbuckled. There was a pot on a rock with water in it. And there was nobody there, and no sound, and the lake was flat as a plate. "Hello," Danny called. "Forest Service." Nothing. The fire popped. He walked the site once, slowly, all the way around the outside, hands off everything. I watched him do it, and I realized he was counting things. Then he came back and stood beside me and said quietly, "Okay, so, tent's got no boots outside it, and the doors zipped from the outside. Pack's got no straps adjusted, they're all factory length. Water's cold." He nodded at the pot. "It's been sitting. How long's the fire been going?" "That's the thing. That fire's been going a long time." He looked at the woodpile. "That's more wood than a person carries in for one night, and none of it's from this basin." My whole body wanted to yell for whoever was out there. I want that in the record. 9 years of medic work, and every instinct I own was screaming that there was a person face down in the brush somewhere within 200 yards of me with a head injury, and that every minute mattered, and that the correct action was to search a spiral pattern out from the site immediately and call it in. "Danny," I said, "what if it's real?" He didn't answer right away, and I respected him for that. "Then somebody's in trouble," he said. "And what we do is walk out to the ridge where we've got line of sight and call it in to Mary, and she calls the county, and a search comes in tomorrow with 12 people who all know the rules in daylight, instead of 2 of us splitting up in the dark." He looked at me. "That's not us doing nothing. That's us doing it the way it works." Then he went to the wood pile and picked up 4 pieces of split larch and laid them on the fire, crosswise, carefully, the way you'd build it up for the night. He did it without hurrying. He straightened up, and he said, out loud, to nobody, in a perfectly polite voice, "That'll hold you till morning." And we walked out on the trail we'd come in on, and neither of us looked back. And behind us I could hear the fire taking the new wood, and it sounded exactly like a fire. The county ran a search up there the next day with 19 people. They found the tent, empty, and about 40 years old, a model that hadn't been sold since the early 80s, with the fabric gone to powder where the sun hit it. They found no pack. They found a fire ring with no ash in it at all. Danny wrote the report. He put down, "Occupied appearance, no persons located, site cold on second visit." Mary signed it. Nobody at the county blinked, and I understood watching that happen that there were probably 100 reports like it in the drawer downstairs, and that the whole system had quietly agreed on a vocabulary for this a long time ago. I broke Rule 4 on the 11th of September, and I broke it on purpose, and I need to explain why, because "she got curious" isn't good enough. By September, I had followed that card for 2 months, and it had cost me a night's sleep, a long walk, and 40 extra miles of driving. That's all. And in return, I had been handed the single largest question of my life, and no way at all to look at it. I had started to feel like a person keeping her eyes closed in a room to avoid seeing the furniture. So on the 11th of September at dusk, I walked down to the Weatherby crossing below the station. and I sat on a rock on the near bank, and I waited to see if anything came. The creek there is maybe 30 feet across and fast, loud enough that you have to raise your voice. Alder on both banks. The light goes early in that bottom because of the ridge, so by 7:30 the far bank was in that blue shadow where color drains out but you can still see shapes fine. At 7:52, something stood on the far bank. It came out of the alder without moving the alder. That was the first thing. My whole life I have known what it looks like when brush lets something through, and this was not that. It was more like a section of the shadow between two trunks resolved and had a shape. Man height. Man-shaped, in the way a coat on a door is man-shaped. It was dark all over, and I could not tell you one thing about its surface, whether it had hair or clothing or skin, because my eyes kept sliding off it and having to start again. It had a head, and the head was turned toward me, and after a moment it tilted. A small movement, maybe 15 degrees, the exact angle a dog uses when it's interested. I looked at it. That was the whole experiment. I sat on a rock in the cold and looked at a thing on the other side of 30 feet of loud water, and it looked back, and the creek ran. And neither of us moved for what I have always thought was about a minute, and my watch said was 9. Then it opened its mouth. It did not make a sound. It stood on the far bank with its face toward me, and it worked its jaw, slowly, deliberately, 6 or 7 times. And I understood with a clarity that has never once faded, that it was practicing, that it was learning the shape my mouth was making or trying shapes on to see which one I'd answer. Then it stopped, and it turned its head slightly further and held that, and I felt the way you do when someone has just decided something about you. I looked down at my own feet. Both boots, the wet rock, a caddis case stuck to the stone. When I looked up, it was gone, and the alder had not moved. I walked back up to the station in the dark, which was stupid, and I got inside and shut the door and stood with my back against it, and Mary looked at me from the desk and put her pen down and said, "Oh, Nora." I told her all of it. It took about 4 minutes. She listened the way she listened to radio traffic without any expression, and when I was done, she got up and poured me a coffee I didn't want and put it in my hands. "How long did you hold it?" 9 minutes. 9. She sat down. "That's okay. That's a lot. What does it do?" "It learns you," she said. "That's all. That's the whole reason for the rule. Everything else on that card is about a thing that already knows how to be a voice. Rule 4 is about how they get the voice in the first place." She looked at the black window over the sink. "They watch. That's not a threat. It doesn't hurt you. Nothing's going to come through that wall tonight. It just means that at some point something out there is going to say something to you in a voice it built by watching your face for 9 minutes. How long until? No pattern I've ever found. Days, years. Aaron went 11 days. She said it plainly without softening it, which I have always been grateful for. You're going to be fine. You just have to be more careful than you were planning to be for a while. The last of the 7 happened 9 days after that, which I don't think was a coincidence. I was on the Cut Bank Trail, coming down from the cabin, about a mile above the trailhead, and there was a ranger coming up. Full uniform, green pants, gray shirt, the badge, the flat hat that almost nobody actually wears in the field, a radio on his belt, and a small green day pack. He was maybe 55, gray at the temples, a heavy-set man with a very pleasant face, and he raised a hand when he saw me and called out, "Afternoon." Everything about him was correct. Every single thing. The uniform was right down to the sewn-on district patch, which is not a thing you can buy. He was walking on the trail. His boots were dusty. He had a sunburn on the back of his hands. The duty board that morning had 3 names on it: Kilgore at the station, Farrow, Loon Meadow, back by 1700, Vance, Cutbank, back by 1600. "Afternoon," I said, and stopped about 15 feet from him, which is a strange distance to stop at, and he noticed. I saw him notice. "You must be the new one." He smiled. "I'm up out of Hamilton. They've got me doing trail condition on this whole side." "That's a lot of ground." "It surely is." The card said to ask them the day of the week. Standing there in the sun, with a friendly middle-aged man in a correct uniform 15 feet away, that instruction felt so insane that I actually considered skipping it. I want that on the record too, because it's the whole point. Every one of these rules is easy in the abstract and nearly impossible in the moment. "Hey," I said, "this is going to sound strange. What day is it?" And he paused. It wasn't long, maybe a second and a half, about the same length of time the mother on the Weatherby Trail had taken to decide about me, just long enough for a smile to stay in place with nothing behind it. Then he said, "Thursday," and it was Thursday, and it did not matter at all, because I had already seen the thing that happened in his face while the answer was being assembled. "Right," I said. "Thanks. Long summer." "It sure has been," he said warmly. I stepped off the downhill side of the trail and started walking, and I did not go to the trailhead where my truck was because the trailhead was 15 minutes downhill, and that was the direction he'd come from, and Rule 7 said walk the wrong way for 10 minutes first. So I contoured east across the slope through open larch, which is miserable walking, and I did 10 minutes by the watch, and then I sat down behind a root ball and I waited another 10, and I listened. At about minute 14, something came along the slope above me, moving in the same direction I'd gone at the speed of a person walking on a trail. There is no trail on that slope. It went past, 30 or 40 yards up, and kept going east, and the sound of it faded, and it did not come back. I gave it another 20 minutes, and then I went straight down the fall line to the road and walked the road to my truck, which was sitting in an empty lot in the afternoon sun with nothing wrong with it at all. On the 29th of September, a man drove into the station yard at 6:40 in the evening with his horn going. His name was Curtis Duarte. He was 44, he was from Bozeman, and his niece Marisol had walked away from their camp at Grayling Lake at about 2 that afternoon to photograph a waterfall a half-mile up the inlet, and had not come back. She was 16. She had a jacket and a phone with no service and no water. There were 6 people in that camp, and 5 of them had been searching and yelling since 4 o'clock and had found nothing, and Curtis had driven 2 hours out to us because there was no other way to tell anybody. Mary had the county on the phone in 90 seconds, and a helicopter request in 4 minutes. Danny was on his way in from Loon, and it was going to be full dark in 50 minutes, and the inlet basin above Grayling is a mile of head-high alder and blowdown, and a girl with a broken ankle in that country at 34 degrees overnight is not a search, it's a race. We went in. That's the part people always want me to justify, and I never will. 3 of us, me, Curtis, and Danny, who caught us at the trailhead, went up the inlet at dusk with headlamps and a radio, because a 16-year-old was on the ground somewhere in there and the helicopter was 90 minutes out. I stopped both of them at the last open ground before the alder, and I said the only thing I could think of that would fit into 30 seconds. "There are going to be voices in there," I said. "Some of them will not be her. You do not go to a voice. You do not answer a voice. You call, and then you listen, and you only move towards something that answers the actual question you asked. If you hear her, you say her name and you ask her something new. Every time. Do you understand me?" Curtis stared at me. "What are you talking about?" "Say yes. Yes. Danny stays with you. Go." The first hour was normal, and it was awful in the normal way. Brush that takes 40 minutes to cross 400 yards, ice water in your boots, 3 headlamps in a mile of black timber, and a girl's name going out into it over and over and coming back off the rock walls of that basin. At 8:20, the voices started. "Help me." Off to the left, low on the slope, a young woman's voice. Curtis went about 4 steps before Danny got a fistful of his jacket. "Help me." Straight ahead now, 200 yards, same voice, same words, and here's the thing I had been waiting for and praying I was right about. Identical, not similar. Identical. The same rise and fall, the same catch in the middle, the same volume, the way a recording is the same. A person in pain does not say a thing twice the same way. A person in pain gets more hoarse, or more angry, or quieter as they give up. Marisol, I called. If you can hear me, tell me what's under you. Rock or dirt or wood. Tell me what's under you. Help me, said the timber, from 3 directions. Tell me what's under you. Help me. Curtis was making a sound I have heard maybe a dozen times in my career and never anywhere else, and he was shaking, and Danny had both arms around him from behind now. That's not her, I said. Curtis, look at me. That is not her voice. That is her voice played back, and every second we spend walking at it is a second we're not finding her. Do you hear me? And then, from far up the basin, thin and cracked and much smaller than the others. I'm on a rock and there's a dead tree. I can't stand up. New words, new information, an answer to my actual question. That's her, I said. That's her. Go, go, go. It took us 31 minutes to cover the last 600 yards. She was on a slab at the base of the waterfall with a broken fibula and the beginnings of hypothermia, and she had been screaming for 6 hours, which is why her voice was gone. And when my light hit her, she started crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Curtis wasn't with us. He'd been 8 feet from Danny at the base of the last talus field. Danny turned to give him a hand up and he wasn't there, and there was no sound. And Danny called his name for a minute and a half and then made the correct and unbearable decision and came on up to me and the girl, because that's what the rules are for. We got Marisol out at 1:20 in the morning. Danny and me and 4 county SAR guys who'd come in behind us in a litter, in the dark. She's fine. She has a rod in her leg and she's studying wildlife biology at Missoula now, and she sends Mary a card every Christmas. They searched for Curtis Duarte for 11 days. 60 people, dogs, 2 helicopters, an infrared pass. They found 1 boot print at the edge of the talus, pointed uphill, away from the direction we had been traveling. Nothing else. Ever. I sat with his sister in the trailhead lot on the 4th day, and she asked me if he'd suffered, and I said no, and I do not know whether that was a lie. I wrote the report on the 10th day, at the desk, with the stove going, and Mary across from me not saying anything. I put down the time of the initial report, and the coordinates, and the weather, and the composition of the search party, and the mechanism of the patient's injury and the extraction time. I put down that C. Duarte separated from the party at about 2140 hours at the base of the talus field, that verbal contact was lost immediately, and that a search was initiated at first light. I did not write down the voices. There's no box on the form for that, and there never will be. And I understand now that this is not a cover-up. It's just that some things can only be handed to the next person the way Mary handed them to me. On a laminated card, by somebody standing in the room with you, who can make you say it back. When I finished, I took the card down off its nail and read the bottom line again. Rule 8. Waiting is not the same as refusing. And I finally understood what it had been telling me all summer, and why Mary wouldn't say it out loud, because it isn't a rule about monsters at all. Every line on that card looks like an instruction to be a worse person. Don't answer. Don't look. Don't help. And that's exactly what the things in that basin are counting on. Not our fear, our decency. They know we run it screaming. They have known it a lot longer than we've known about them. They don't need to be strong or fast or clever, because we will cross any distance in the dark for a voice that says, "Help me," and we will do it gladly, and we will do it again tomorrow. The card doesn't tell you not to go. Curtis is gone because he went 4 steps too early, and Marisol is alive because I stood in the black timber with my heart coming apart and made the woods answer a question first. That's all Rule 8 is. Not, don't help. Just, make sure there's someone there to help. I came back the next season, and the one after that. Mary retired in June, and I run Ashwater now. There's a new seasonal coming up the road next week, 26 years old, very sure of herself. Drove up from Colorado with brand new boots. The card is off its nail and sitting on the desk in front of me. Last winter I added a 9th line at the bottom in my own handwriting. the way somebody did before me, and I had it laminated over in Hamilton so it'll outlast me. Rule 9. You will want to explain all of this to yourself. Do that on your own time. Follow the card tonight. I suppose it is expected that anybody who chooses to follow in the footsteps of Smokey the Bear would be possibly stuck in a few scary situations. That certainly was the case for me as I spent my nights working alongside park rangers on some of most dangerous and terrifying trails in the States. It's not what one might think about being a ranger, though. We don't spend every day sitting around watching deer graze or children play in the playgrounds. Instead, what happens behind those locked gates is something more akin to horror movies than a picnic. If you manage to find your way through these wooded corridors without being eaten alive by some wild animal or eaten after a bear, you could end up with some serious psychological damage. As my first summer as a ranger was coming to an end, I decided that I wanted to spend one last night in the woods alone. Not many rangers do that kind of thing anymore, but for me, it was sort of this cleansing ritual. My girlfriend had just broken up with me at the time, and I needed time to work through that emotional trauma. I knew there were other people who understood my pain. They would be likely willing to talk about the world ending when we got close enough in proximity. Every man needs his space from time to time, even if he is working within the confines of the law. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what to expect to be out there in the woods with no one else around. I had been alone quite a few times before, but never running into any real trouble. But this time, my mind was racing through the worst-case scenarios, and it almost felt like fate that I would get caught up in some kind of adventure. The breakup with Sarah had been devastating. 3 years together, and she ended it with a text message while I was on duty. "We want different things," she wrote. The truth was that she wanted the stability of city life, and I couldn't give up the wilderness. The parks had become my sanctuary after my father died 2 years ago. He'd been a ranger for 30 years before cancer took him, and following in his footsteps felt like keeping part of him alive. My supervisor, Jenkins, had tried to talk me out of the solo overnight. "The trails at Oroville are getting strange reports lately," he'd said, his weathered face creased with concern. 3 hikers went missing last month. They turned up eventually, but they were different. Wouldn't talk about what happened. I dismissed his concerns with the confidence of youth. "I know every inch of that park, sir. I'll stick to the established areas." He'd sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "At least take the radio." The radio now hung at my belt, silent as the trees around me. I'd sworn I would use it if anything unusual happened, but what constitutes unusual in a place where mountain lions scream like murdered women and bears can appear from nowhere like furry ghosts? As the afternoon waned, I packed my gear: standard issue sleeping bag, first aid kit, water purification tablets, emergency flares, a hunting knife my father had given me on my 16th birthday, and enough food for 24 hours. I'd left my itinerary with the station as required, marking my intended camping spot near the eastern shore of Lake Oroville. Jenkins' parting words echoed in my mind as I locked my truck at the ranger station. "The woods have been restless lately, Miller, like they're hiding something." At the time, I'd laughed. Now, as shadows lengthened across the trail and the late August heat began to dissipate, his words carried an ominous weight I couldn't shake. The trail to Lake Oroville wound through ancient redwoods that blocked the fading sunlight, creating a premature dusk on the forest floor. Normally, I found comfort in the embrace of these giants, but today the silence felt oppressive. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crunch of my boots on fallen pine needles and my own breathing. I reached the first junction and hesitated. The main trail continued straight, well-maintained and regularly patrolled. The smaller path to the right descended more steeply toward my favorite spot, a secluded inlet rarely visited by tourists. Standing at this crossroads, I felt a prickle along my spine, as though unseen eyes were watching from the deepening shadows. "Get a grip, Miller," I muttered to myself, adjusting my pack. "This is your home." I chose the right-hand path, moving deeper into territory I knew well but suddenly felt foreign. The radio at my hip emitted a burst of static, making me jump. I unclipped it, bringing it to my ear, but heard only the empty hiss of dead air. Ranger Station, this is Miller. Radio check, over. No response came through the static. I tried again, with the same result. We knew there were dead zones in the park where the mountains blocked the signal, but this wasn't one of them. At least, it hadn't been before. Unease crawled up my spine, but I pressed on. The lake would be visible soon, and with it would come the open sky and, hopefully, better reception. The trail narrowed, forcing me to duck under low-hanging branches that seemed to reach for my pack like grasping fingers. A sudden crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight. I froze, scanning the dense undergrowth for movement. Nothing. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A low, rhythmic humming, almost like chanting, rising and falling on the still air. My first thought was illegal campers. We'd had problems with occult groups in the past, drawn to the ancient trees for their rituals, usually harmless but a fire hazard and disturbance to wildlife. I continued forward more cautiously, one hand on my knife, the other reaching for the flashlight as daylight continued to fade. The trail opened onto a small clearing, and beyond it the dark waters of Lake Oroville stretched into the distance, reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. My favorite spot lay just ahead, a natural peninsula that jutted into the water, creating a perfect campsite surrounded on three sides by the lake. The humming had stopped, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Relief washed over me. Whatever I had heard was gone, and the familiar view of the lake restored my confidence. I would make camp, get some sleep, and in the morning, everything would seem less ominous. Sarah and her rejection would be just another memory to leave behind in the city. I just crossed over one of the small bridges leading across the lake when I heard something rustling behind me. More similar to low growls than anything else, really. It sounded like something was stalking towards me. Perhaps a bear. The only thing about these sounds that didn't scream bear were its frequency. They were more sporadic than I would have expected. My ears picked up this distinct sound of footsteps. More than once, actually, as if somebody were running towards me, directly through the thicket. Not wanting to meet with whatever was out there on my own terms, I scrambled for one of the trees and threw myself up into it to try and hide. Unfortunately, jumping back had cost me more time than I realized, and by the time that I reached around and grabbed hold of a branch, something hit me hard right in the side. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs and sent me sprawling across the forest floor. My pack cushioned some of the fall, but pain radiated through my ribs. I gasped, trying to pull air back into my body, my vision swimming with black spots. Through the disorientation, I heard those footsteps again, multiple sets circling me. I rolled onto my back, fumbling for my knife, but my fingers found only empty leather. The sheath had torn open in the fall, the blade lost somewhere in the darkness. "Who's there?" I called, my voice hoarse. "This is Ranger Miller. Identify yourself." Only silence answered me, broken by the soft snap of twigs as whatever circled me continued its approach. I activated my flashlight, sweeping the beam in a wide arc around me. The light caught a figure just beyond the trees. Humanoid, but wrong somehow. It ducked away before I could focus, but the glimpse I caught froze the blood in my veins. Gaunt, pale skin stretched over an elongated face, eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in my side. My radio. I needed to call for backup. I grabbed it from my belt, pressing the transmit button with trembling fingers. "Emergency! Ranger Miller at East Oroville. Coordinates..." Something struck my hand, sending the radio flying into the underbrush. I spun, swinging the flashlight like a club, but hit only air. The footsteps had multiplied, coming from all directions now. My light caught flashes of movement, thin, agile forms darting between trees, always staying just at the edge of visibility. "I'm armed," I lied, backing toward the lake. Water at my back would limit their approach to one direction. State Park law enforcement, stand down. A high, keening sound rose from the forest, not quite human, not quite animal. It was answered by similar calls, a nightmarish chorus surrounding me. I counted at least 5 distinct voices communicating in some primal language I couldn't comprehend. The peninsula was 30 yards away. If I could reach it, set up a defensive position, maybe light one of the emergency flares. I took a deep breath and ran. The forest erupted into movement behind me. Branches whipped my face as I sprinted down the narrow trail, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead. The footsteps gained on me, impossibly fast, accompanied by that terrible keening that seemed to come from everywhere at once. 20 yards. My lungs burned, each breath sending shards of pain through my injured ribs. 10 yards. The open area of the peninsula was visible now, the dark water beyond it, my only hope of safety. 5 yards. Something snagged my ankle, sending me crashing to the ground. My flashlight flew from my grasp, spinning across the dirt to illuminate a grotesque scene. Pale, emaciated figures emerging from the tree line, moving with a terrible, fluid grace that no human could possess. I kicked frantically at whatever held my ankle, connecting with something solid. A hiss of pain, and my leg was free. I scrambled forward on hands and knees, reaching for the flashlight. My fingers had just closed around it when something heavy landed on my back, driving me into the ground. Hot breath against my neck. The smell of earth and something rotten. A voice, barely human, whispered words I couldn't understand, but the malice in them needed no translation. I bucked and twisted, fighting with the desperate strength of pure terror. My elbow connected with something that gave way with a wet crunch. The weight on my back lessened and I rolled free, swinging the flashlight in a wide arc. The beam caught my attacker, a male figure, naked and filthy, its skin a pallid gray in the harsh light. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares, features almost human but twisted, as though sculpted by someone who had only ever heard descriptions of people. The nose was flattened, nostrils flared like a bat's. The mouth stretched too wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. And the eyes. God, the eyes. Huge and black with no whites at all, like polished obsidian set into that horrific face. It shrieked, throwing up a hand to shield itself from the light. I seized the moment, staggering to my feet and lunging toward the peninsula. Behind me, others joined the shrieking, the sound building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very air. I reached the open ground of the peninsula and spun to face my pursuers, flashlight held before me like a talisman. They gathered at the tree line, 7 or 8 of them, their inhuman faces contorted with rage or hunger, or some emotion I had no name for. My free hand found the emergency flare in my jacket pocket. One twist of the cap, one sharp strike, and red light exploded into the night, casting everything in a hellish glow. The creatures recoiled, their shrieks turning to hisses of pain or fear. For one heartbeat, I thought I was safe. Then one of them, taller than the rest with a necklace of what looked horribly like human teeth, stepped forward. It raised a hand, and the others fell silent. In the red glare of the flare, it smiled at me, a terrible knowing smile that held centuries of malice. It spoke, a single guttural word that seemed to vibrate in my bones. And then they charged. I hurled the flare at the nearest one, catching it in the chest. It went down screaming, its skin sizzling where the phosphorus touched. But the others kept coming. I turned to run for the water, but strong hands grabbed me from behind, spinning me around. The tall one stood before me, its black eyes reflecting the dying light of the flare. It reached out one long-fingered hand and pressed it against my forehead. Pain exploded behind my eyes, and darkness swallowed me whole. You know, it feels like forever before I felt like landing against something soft and squishy. It wasn't exactly warm or inviting, so all of those other feelings must just be an illusion brought on by adrenaline. It only took a single moment for me to realize what had been happening, that I had been wrapped at the ankles, waist, shoulders, and neck in some kind of netting. I didn't know what exactly it was made out of. But it wasn't rope. It was some sort of binding material. My hands were then completely immobilized by entanglement as well, so there wasn't much I could do, other than struggle against my bonds. A dead-end endeavor, yet there was ever one. Now, the first thing I noticed, when I could finally see again, is it was completely dark around me. Consciousness returned slowly, my mind struggling to piece together fragmented sensations. The netting that bound me was fibrous, but damp, as though soaked in some viscous liquid that had partially dried. It clung to my skin like a second layer, tightening when I struggled against it. The smell was overwhelming, earthy and organic, like decaying vegetation mixed with something metallic that might have been blood. My head throbbed where the creature had touched me. The pain radiated outward in pulses that matched my heartbeat, each one sending fresh waves of nausea through my body. I tried to focus, to control my breathing, and assess my situation. Ranger training had covered wilderness survival, first aid, even hostage scenarios, but nothing about being captured by whatever these things were. All light coming from behind with only blackness ahead. Two dim lights appeared along the walls on either side of me and began approaching slowly, as my eyes would now adjust. They were really more like natural animal eyes than any sort of man-made illusions. Even worse, I noticed that the blackness ahead of me wasn't really coming from a lack of light at all. Instead, there appeared to be some kind of organic wall blocking at my view, spreading out across the room to each side. I had no idea how large this place was, but it must have been bigger than what I could see. One behind me and another in front of me. They made themselves known moments later. Footsteps. The noises were too far away for me to make out at first, but then I could hear they belonged to something. As my vision adjusted to the near darkness, details of my prison emerged. I was in some kind of underground chamber, the walls rough-hewn from the living rock, but overlaid with that same organic material that bound me. A network of fibrous strands that glistened with moisture, pulsing subtly as though alive. The floor beneath me was surprisingly smooth, worn by what must have been centuries of use. The approaching lights resolved into crude torches, held by two of the smaller creatures. They moved with that same unnatural grace I had witnessed in the forest, their naked bodies covered in ritualistic markings, not tattoos but raised welts in geometric patterns that suggested self-mutilation. Behind them came others, at least a dozen, filing into the chamber in eerie silence. Last came the tall one who had rendered me unconscious, now adorned with additional ornaments, bones and teeth and small animal skulls woven into its matted hair. It carried something in its hands, a bowl made from what appeared to be a human skull, its top sawn off and the interior lined with that same fibrous material. The tall one approached, its black eyes studying me with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than bestial rage would have been. It understood me. It knew what I was, and what I was thinking. I could feel its mind touching mine, probing at the edges of my consciousness like fingers testing the strength of a door. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cracking from thirst and fear. "Who are you?" The tall one tilted its head, considering me. Then it spoke, its voice a rasp like stone grinding against stone. "We are the Forgotten, and you are trespassing." The words hit me like physical blows, not because of their meaning, but because they existed at all. These creatures could speak. They had language, identity, purpose. "I'm a park ranger," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I protect the forest. I'm not trespassing." A sound emerged from the tall one's throat, a dry, rattling noise that might have been laughter. "Your kind has forgotten what it means to protect. You build your roads and your towers. You cut down the ancient ones. You poison the waters. And you call this protection?" It dipped a finger into the skull bowl, drawing out a thick, dark substance. With deliberate movements, it began to trace symbols on my forehead, my cheeks, my chin. The substance burned where it touched my skin, not with heat, but with a deep, penetrating cold. that seemed to reach into my bones. "We remember," it continued, its face inches from mine. "We remember when your kind lived in fear of the dark places, when you understood your place in the order of things, before you forgot." "What are you going to do to me?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. The tall one stepped back, surveying its handiwork. "We are going to help you remember." It raised the bowl above its head and began to chant in that same guttural language I had heard in the forest. The others joined in, their voices blending into a sound like rushing water or distant thunder. The organic material around me seemed to respond, pulsing in time with their chanting, tightening and then relaxing around my limbs. From the shadows emerged two more creatures, carrying between them what looked like a crude litter woven from the same fibrous material. On it lay a collection of plants, flowers, roots, and fungi I didn't recognize, though my ranger training had included extensive botanical knowledge of the region. The tall one selected a pale, luminescent mushroom from the collection. It crushed the fungus in its long fingers, releasing spores that glowed briefly in the torchlit air before settling on my face. I tried to hold my breath, but the need for oxygen eventually forced me to inhale. The spores burned in my lungs, spreading fire through my veins. Vision blurred. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from inside my own head now. The walls of the chamber appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting like a massive lung. The creatures' forms shifted and flowed, sometimes appearing human, sometimes animal, sometimes something else entirely. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours or days might have passed as I lay there, my mind unraveling under the influence of whatever I had inhaled. Visions came and went. Sarah's face, twisted with the same inhuman features as my captors. My father, emerging from the organic walls with fungi growing from his eye sockets. The forest above, its roots reaching down through the earth to wrap around my body. Through it all, the tall one watched, its black eyes reflecting nothing. Occasionally it would speak, not in its rasping voice but directly into my mind. "Remember. Remember what you are. Remember what came before, and more than two." Now at this point, fear began gripping my heart as I lashed out against my binds once again, only to find they hadn't been loosened in the slightest. Or so I thought. We'll get to that in a moment. I was hauled from my small prison by several sets of long-clawed hands that dragged over what appeared to be some kind of altar. It was a much different from one of those sacrificial altars, appearing to be used in ancient times for rituals, meant to appease unworldly beings were said to lurk within the space between two worlds. But this one seemed more like a place where people got together for satanic worship or other unholy activities. These beings holding me lured me down onto it and began weaving this sort of flower. The altar stone was cold against my back, the surface worn smooth by what must have been countless similar ceremonies. As my hallucinations began to fade, leaving behind a terrible clarity, I could see that the chamber had transformed. Or perhaps I was seeing it truly for the first time. The space was vast, much larger than I had initially perceived, with a ceiling that rose at least 30 feet above the altar. The walls were lined with niches, each containing what appeared to be offerings, personal effects that I recognized with horror as belonging to hikers and campers. Watches, cameras, wallets, wedding rings, tokens of those who had disappeared in the park over the years. The creatures, the Forgotten, as their leader had named them, surrounded the altar in concentric circles, swaying in perfect unison. The tall one stood at my head, its hands raised toward the ceiling where a natural chimney in the rock allowed a single shaft of moonlight to penetrate the darkness. "The cycle continues," it intoned, and the others repeated the phrase in that same grinding language. "The old ways endure, the forest remembers, even when man forgets." They began weaving elaborate patterns with the flowers and plants, starting at my feet and working their way up my body. Each plant was placed with precise care, the pattern clearly significant in ways I couldn't comprehend. Some of the flowers I recognized: trillium, wild ginger, bleeding heart, native species that grew in the darkest parts of the forest. Others were entirely unknown to me, with impossible colors and shapes that seemed to shift when viewed directly. All around me, while chanting something in this ungodly language, I was so terrified I swear I could have had a heart attack. I couldn't make out all the words, but I had no idea what this thing was or what they were saying. The entire group of these things began chanting in unison as they surrounded me, continued weaving more of this plant material around me. It felt like forever. The tall one produced a bone knife, its edge honed to razor sharpness. My heart seized with terror as it approached, but instead of cutting me, it used the knife to slice its own palm. Dark blood welled from the wound, almost black in the dim light. It held its hand over my face, allowing 3 drops to fall onto my forehead. "You will carry our mark," it said, its voice penetrating my skull like a physical force. "You will remember, and you will speak of what you have seen. The others will not believe, but the seed will be planted. The old fear will grow again." The blood burned where it touched my skin, sinking into the pores as though alive. I could feel it spreading beneath the surface, tracing patterns through my veins, reaching toward my heart. I screamed then, a sound of pure animal terror that echoed through the chamber and down the tunnels beyond. The Forgotten responded with sounds of their own, not mocking as I first thought, but joining me in a chorus of primal emotion that transcended language. It was communication in its most basic form, the expression of feeling without the filter of words. As our voices mingled in that underground space, something shifted in my perception. For a brief, terrifying moment, I understood them. Not their words, but their existence. They were ancient, these creatures, remnants of something that had dwelled in these lands long before humans arrived. They had retreated underground as civilization spread, preserving their ways in these hidden places, emerging only to remind humanity of what had been forgotten. The tall one sensed my understanding and leaned closer, its black eyes inches from mine. "Yes," it whispered, its breath hot against my face. "Now you begin to see." It placed both hands on either side of my head, its long fingers tangling in my hair. The chanting rose to a crescendo, the words now seeming almost familiar, as though I had heard them in a dream or another life. The plants around me began to glow with a pale greenish light that intensified with the chanting. Pain lanced through my skull as the tall one's fingers tightened. Images flooded my mind. The forest, as it had been thousands of years ago. The first humans to encounter the Forgotten. Rituals much like this one conducted through centuries. The gradual retreat of the creatures as cities grew and wilderness shrank. Their adaptation to life in the dark places beneath the earth. And with the images came understanding. They were not trying to kill me. They were changing me, marking me, making me a witness to their continued existence. I was to be released, to carry the memory of them back to the world above. A reminder that humans were not the first to claim this land, and that the old ways persisted in the shadows, before they finally got to the last one. All I could do was just lay there on my back, completely immobilized by flowers, while these creatures circled around me once and turned their backs towards me. The chant stopped abruptly, and every creature but one turned to leave. The remaining one tossed this mask aside, revealing a set of devilish features underneath it. What I had been dealing with. The tall one stood alone beside the altar now, its followers having retreated into the shadows. It studied me with those bottomless eyes, and I had the unsettling sensation that it was memorizing my face, storing the image away in some ancient memory. "You will return to your world," it said, its voice softer now. "You will speak of what you have seen, and you will not be believed. This is as it should be. The truth remains strongest when it dwells in the realm of doubt." It reached down and began to undo the bindings of plants and fibers that held me to the altar. As each restraint was removed, feeling flooded back into my limbs with painful intensity. When the last binding fell away, the tall one stepped back, gesturing toward a dark opening in the chamber wall that I hadn't noticed before. "That way leads up," it said. "Follow it, and do not stray from the path. Others of us are less accommodating to your kind." I sat up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest. The markings on my skin still burned, and when I touched my forehead, my fingers came away stained with a mixture of blood and some unidentifiable substance. The plants that had bound me were wilting already, their brief luminescence fading as they died. "Why me?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Why did you choose me?" The tall one tilted its head, that same considering gesture I had seen before. "We did not choose you. You chose us when you came alone to our domain. But you are suitable. You walk between worlds already, not fully of the city, not fully of the wild. A bridge." It turned away, moving toward the shadows where its followers had disappeared. "Remember," it said, without looking back, "and fear the dark places as your ancestors did. It will keep you alive." Then it was gone, leaving me alone on the altar in the dim light of the remaining torches. I struggled to my feet, swaying with weakness and the residual effects of whatever I had inhaled. The path the creature had indicated was barely visible, a slightly lighter shade of darkness against the chamber wall. I had no choice but to follow it. My equipment was gone. No flashlight, no radio, no weapon. Just the clothes on my back and the burning marks on my skin that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. The tunnel was narrow, forcing me to crouch as I moved forward. The walls were slick with moisture, occasionally breaking open into smaller chambers or branching passages. I kept to the main path as instructed, though several times I heard movements and whispers from these side tunnels that made my skin crawl. Time lost meaning in that lightless labyrinth. I might have walked for hours or days, guided only by the faint phosphorescence of fungi growing on the tunnel ceiling. My mind fluctuated between crystal clarity and hallucinatory confusion, the tall one's blood still working its way through my system. Eventually, the tunnel began to slope upward, the air growing fresher with each step. Hope kindled in my chest. I was nearing the surface. The path grew steeper, changing from smooth stone to rough-hewn steps cut into the living rock. My legs trembled with exhaustion as I climbed, but the promise of escape drove me onward. Looked like a combination of wild, feral human beings and kind of goblin-ish people. You know what it kind of reminded me of? The trolls or orcs in Lord of the Rings. Humanoid, feral-looking, but also not human. That's what they reminded me of. It stood there, shaking its head from side to side slowly with its arms raised upward as I tried to break free. Now, again, I cannot reiterate how terrifying this was. I had no idea what was going to happen, and I was convinced in that moment I was about to be sacrificed by some sort of under-cave-dwelling creatures. I was so scared beyond belief. Then this thing pulled its arm down after shaking its head and walked away. Completely immobilized, I tried my best to get out of my entrapment. The final creature disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my terror and the slowly loosening plant bindings. Whatever ritual they had performed seemed to have altered the properties of the material. What had been impossibly strong now began to give way under my desperate struggles. I worked first at freeing my right hand, wiggling my fingers until I could grip the edge of the binding. It peeled away reluctantly, the fibers seeming almost reluctant to release their hold on my skin. As soon as my hand was free, I tore at the restraints across my chest and then my other limbs. And I believe it was the massive amounts of adrenaline exploding through my entire being that allowed me to break free. As I did, though, I could hear these things coming back, and I knew I had to escape as quick as I could. Once fully free, I started to run for it, escaping in just a matter of time, feeling my way out of this black organic labyrinth. I don't know if I was in a cave or what this was, but as I reflect back on these memories, sounds echoed through the tunnels. The shuffle of bare feet on stone, the rasping breath of creatures moving in the darkness. They were returning, perhaps sensing that their captive was attempting escape. Fear gave me new strength as I stumbled forward, hands outstretched to feel the way through the pitch-black passage. The tunnel forked, and I hesitated, trying to recall which way I had been brought. A dim glow emanated from the left-hand passage, not the warm light of torches, but the cold, pale illumination of those phosphorescent fungi. I chose that path, reasoning that the fungi needed at least some connection to the surface to survive. The passage narrowed, the ceiling dropping so low that I was forced to crawl. The stone floor abraded my palms and knees, but I pressed on, driven by the sounds of pursuit that grew steadily louder behind me. The air grew fresher, carrying the scent of pine and clean earth. The surface couldn't be far now. Ahead, a faint gray light beckoned, starlight filtering through some opening. I redoubled my efforts, ignoring the pain of scraped skin and overtaxed muscles. The passage ended in a vertical shaft, perhaps 10 feet high, with roots dangling from its earthen walls. Above, I could see a patch of night sky framed by the twisted shapes of tree roots. The sounds behind me grew louder, clicks and hisses, the scrabble of claws on stone. They were almost upon me. With desperate strength, I began to climb, grasping at roots and digging my fingers into the earthen walls of the shaft. Dirt showered down as I pulled myself upward. Each inch gained a victory over gravity and exhaustion. A hand closed around my ankle, cold, strong fingers digging into my flesh. I kicked blindly, connecting with something solid. A shriek of pain echoed through the shaft, and the grip released. I scrambled higher, my hands finally reaching the edge of the opening above. With one final surge of strength, I pulled myself through the gap and into the cool night air of the forest. I lay there for a moment, gasping, the loamy soil against my face the sweetest sensation I had ever experienced. But there was no time to rest. Clawed hands were already reaching through the opening, grasping at air. I staggered to my feet, trying to orient myself. The forest was unfamiliar in the darkness, but the stars above provided some guidance. The North Star hung low on the horizon. I needed to head south to reach the ranger station. I began to run, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. Behind me, inhuman cries rose from the earth as the creatures emerged from their underground domain. The hunt was on. I ran as I had never run before, ignoring the protests of my battered body. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent fresh waves of terror through me. They knew these woods far better than I did, even in darkness. The trees began to thin, and ahead I could see the gleam of moonlight on water. The lake. I had somehow circled back to Lake Oroville. New hope surged through me. I knew this area, could find my way from here. The ranger station was 5 miles south along the lakeshore. A figure loomed suddenly from the darkness, blocking my path. One of the creatures, its black eyes reflecting starlight. I skidded to a halt, casting about desperately for a weapon. My hand closed around a fallen branch, and I swung it with all my remaining strength. The branch connected with a sickening crack, and the creature fell. I didn't wait to see if it would rise again. Instead, plunging onward toward the lake. More shapes moved in the forest around me, converging on my position. The lakeshore was only yards away now. If I could reach the water, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. Pain exploded in my ankle, but adrenaline pushed it aside. I scrambled forward on hands and knees, then forced myself upright again. The lakeshore was before me, a narrow strip of pebbly beach leading to the dark water beyond. I splashed into the shallows just as the creatures reached the tree line. They halted there, hissing and clicking in what seemed like frustration. One stepped forward, the tall one, its necklace of teeth gleaming in the moonlight. "Remember," it called, its rasping voice carrying clearly across the water. "Remember, and fear." I waded deeper, the cold water now at my waist. The creatures remained at the shoreline, watching with those terrible black eyes. They would not follow me into the water, I realized, whether from inability or some taboo. I didn't know and didn't care. The lake offered safety. I dove forward, striking out with powerful strokes toward the center of the lake. The water was bitter cold, sapping my strength, but I forced myself to continue. Behind me, the creature's cries faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of waves against my ears. I swam until my arms felt like lead, then rolled onto my back to float, staring up at the star-filled sky. The full moon illuminated the lake like a spotlight, turning the water to liquid silver. In that moment of exhaustion and relief, a strange calm settled over me. I had survived. Whatever the forgotten had done to me, whatever their purpose, I had escaped. When I felt strength returning to my limbs, I turned and swam for the southern shore, toward the ranger station. Each stroke was agony, my muscles protesting after the ordeal they had endured. But the pain was real, human pain, not the otherworldly burning of the creature's markings. My feet touched bottom eventually, and I dragged myself onto the shore, collapsing on the rocky beach. Dawn was breaking, the eastern sky lightening to pearl gray. I lay there watching the sun rise, feeling its warmth on my face like a benediction. I had almost convinced myself that the whole experience had been some vivid hallucination. Perhaps I'd eaten something toxic, or suffered a head injury in a fall, when I caught sight of my reflection in a still pool of water near the shore. Dark markings covered my face, swirling patterns that pulsed slightly with each heartbeat. The tall one's blood had left its mark, just as it had promised. I had no recollection of how I managed to reach the ranger station. Park visitors found me stumbling along the main trail, delirious and babbling about underground creatures. By the time the medical team arrived, I had lost consciousness. I had so much flooding through my mind, I feel like I kind of blacked out. I don't really know if I remember much after that, but I do distinctly remember collapsing on the ground and being found later on. I know that's probably very anticlimactic, but when the human body endures that kind of trauma, stress, it does things to the brain that aren't exactly normal. Anyway, I was treated at the hospital. I awoke in a hospital bed 3 days later, an IV dripping fluids into my arm and monitoring equipment beeping steadily beside me. Jenkins sat in a chair by the window, his weathered face lined with concern. When he saw I was awake, he moved to my bedside. "Welcome back, Miller," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You had us worried." "The creatures," I began, my voice a dry rasp. "The forgotten. Did you find—" "Easy now," he interrupted, pouring a cup of water from a pitcher on the bedside table. "The doctor said you were suffering from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and possible hallucinogenic effects from an unidentified fungal toxin. There were spores in your lungs like nothing they've ever seen before." I tried to sit up, but weakness forced me back against the pillows. It wasn't hallucinations. They were real. They took me underground, performed some kind of ritual. Jenkins' expression shifted to one I would come to know well in the days that followed, a mixture of pity and discomfort. "We found evidence that you'd made camp near the eastern shore of the lake. Then something happened. Your gear was scattered, signs of a struggle. We think you might have been attacked by an animal, fell into the lake, and washed up on the southern shore. The toxins could have entered your system through an open wound." "The markings," I insisted, raising a hand to my face. "They're still there, the tall one's blood. But my fingers found only smooth skin, unmarked save for a few scratches from my flight through the forest." Jenkins shook his head slowly. "There were no markings when we found you, Miller. Just dirt, blood from some minor cuts, and what looked like plant residue. The doctors cleaned you up." I fell silent, confusion and doubt beginning to creep into my certainty. Had it all been a hallucination? A toxic reaction to some unknown fungus combined with the emotional stress of Sarah's rejection and my isolation in the forest? Ultimately taken back to the station and sent home. I didn't actually believe what I experienced first. I thought it was some crude nightmare or horrible hallucination. But it wasn't until later that I realized it must have been something that really happened, because I actually had binding marks around my ankles, my thighs, my waist, and my wrists. Those bindings were on tight. The medical report noted ligature marks consistent with restrictive binding. but attributed them to possible self-entanglement in climbing ropes or fishing line during my delirium. No one would consider the alternative, that I had been bound with living plant material by creatures that shouldn't exist. I was placed on medical leave for 6 weeks, with mandatory counseling sessions twice weekly. The department psychologist listened patiently to my story before diagnosing me with acute stress disorder, possibly triggered by my recent breakup and exacerbated by isolation and exposure to unknown toxins. The mind is remarkably creative when processing trauma, she explained during our 3rd session. It constructs narratives to make sense of experiences too difficult to process directly. These underground creatures could represent your fears about the relationship ending, being dragged down into dark emotions, feeling bound by your attachments. Her interpretation made a certain logical sense, but it couldn't explain everything. The specific details of the forgotten, their appearance, their rituals, their strange language, seemed too elaborate, too consistent to be mere fabrications of a stressed mind. And then there were the dreams. They began a week after my return home. Vivid dreams of underground chambers, of the tall one watching me with those bottomless black eyes, of plants growing from my skin like living tattoos. I would wake gasping, certain that the markings had returned, only to find my skin unmarked in the harsh light of my bedside lamp. But sometimes in certain lights or at certain angles I would catch glimpses in the mirror of patterns beneath my skin, flowing like dark water through my veins. They would vanish when I looked directly, leaving me questioning my own perception. And I must have wiggled free enough that I loosened them. Like I said, whatever the bindings were this crude rope vine material. I've never seen it before in my life. None of them really believed me, though, when I actually got a chance to describe what happened. They thought I was either making it up or just had a bad nightmare. As you can probably bet, this incident has been difficult for me. At any rate, this is my story. I returned to duty after 2 months, but things were different. Jenkins assigned me to the visitor center rather than patrol duties, citing concerns about my recovery process. My fellow rangers treated me with a careful politeness that barely masked their discomfort. Word had spread about my breakdown in the woods. Sarah called once, awkwardly expressing concern about what she'd heard. "Mom knows someone at the hospital," she explained. "She told me you were found wandering in the woods, talking about underground people or something." The conversation was brief and painful, confirming that whatever we had shared was truly over. I requested a transfer to another park at the end of that season. Jenkins approved it with obvious relief, writing a carefully worded recommendation that emphasized my dedication and knowledge of park systems, while avoiding any mention of my experience at Lake Oroville. My new posting was at a small desert preserve in Arizona, about as different from the forests of Northern California as possible. No ancient trees, no dark undergrowth, no hidden caves. Just open sky and sun-baked earth that held no secrets beneath its surface. Or so I believed. It was during my 3rd month there that I found the petroglyphs in a remote canyon. Ancient rock art, estimated to be at least 2,000 years old according to the park archaeologist. Most depicted familiar scenes, hunters, animals, rain symbols. But on one sheltered panel, partially hidden behind a boulder, was a series of figures that stopped my breath in my throat. Elongated bodies, oversized heads with large dark eyes, long fingers ending in claws, and around them, rendered in the same red ochre, were swirling patterns identical to the markings I had seen on my own skin in the mirror. The archaeologist dismissed them as stylized shamanic figures, representing the spirit world. But I knew better. The forgotten weren't unique to Oroville. They had been here all along, retreating underground as human civilization spread across the continent, preserving their ancient ways in the dark places beneath the earth. I've been researching ever since, carefully and quietly. Ancient myths about subterranean people, unexplained disappearances in national parks, indigenous legends about the old ones who lived in caves and emerged only at night. The patterns are there for those willing to see them. And I hope you can get enjoyment from a real-life traumatic event. I don't care if you believe me and if you choose to read this, which, by the way, you have permission to. I don't care if your readers believe me. I know there's something out there that lives underneath the ground, something that isn't quite human. Sometimes on nights when the moon is full, I feel the markings burning beneath my skin. I wake from dreams of underground chambers and ritual chants with the Tall One's final words echoing in my mind. Remember, and fear the dark places. I do remember, and I do fear. But I also understand now what the Tall One meant when it called me a bridge. I stand between worlds, the rational daylight world of ranger stations and visitor centers, and the ancient shadow world of the forgotten. I've never returned to Lake Oroville. My personnel file contains a medical restriction against posting me there, a bureaucratic blessing in disguise. But sometimes I wonder if the forgotten are waiting for me, if the Tall One looks up from the darkness beneath the ancient trees and remembers the human who carried its mark back to the world above. Perhaps it's watching even now as I write these words, fulfilling the purpose it set for me in that underground chamber, to speak of what I've seen, to plant the seed of old fear in those who listen, to remind humanity that we were not the first to claim this land and that the old ways persist in the shadows. Remember, and fear the dark places as your ancestors did. It will keep you alive.